Tonight, picture a small island at the edge of the world. It is early summer in the year 793, and off the windswept coast of northern England there lies a low green tidal island, joined to the mainland twice a day by a causeway of wet sand that the sea covers and uncovers as it pleases, so that the island spends half its life as part of England and half its life alone. The tide is out just now, and the sand flats are shining in the first light of morning like a sheet of hammered silver, and the air smells of salt and seaweed and the cold, clean emptiness of the North Sea. On the island there stands a monastery, a scattering of small stone and timber buildings gathered around a modest church, and from one of those buildings comes the low, unhurried sound of monks singing the morning office, their voices rising and falling together like slow water. A bell has just finished ringing, and the last of its bronze hum is still fading out over the dunes. Seabirds are walking on the wet sand. A grey seal has hauled itself out on a rock offshore and lies there like a comma, perfectly content. In the monastery garden a young brother is bending over a row of beans, and in the writing room an older monk is grinding a little dish of colour for the great gospel book the island is famous for, a book whose pages swirl with interlaced birds and beasts in inks of gold and lapis blue, one of the most beautiful things ever made in these islands. Nothing here is in a hurry. Nothing here has ever needed to be. This island has been holy ground for 150 years, so safe and so respected that it keeps its treasures in wooden chests with simple latches. Because who in the world would ever harm a house of God at the far quiet edge of everything? And far out on the horizon, where the grey sea meets the grey sky, there is something small and square that was not there yesterday. It might be a cloud. It might be the sail of a trading ship come up from the south with wine and news. The young brother in the garden straightens his back, shades his eyes, looks at it for a moment, and then goes back to his beans. That is all. That is the whole of it. And yet what is out there on that horizon is about to begin one of the great ages of the world, an age that will last very nearly 300 years, an age of dragon-headed ships and burning abbeys, but also of poets and farmers and lawmakers, of merchants who will walk the streets of Constantinople and settlers who will raise their turf houses in lands no European has ever seen, of an ocean crossed in open boats a full 5 centuries before anyone else dared it, and of kingdoms, whole modern countries, that will trace their beginnings to the people in those ships. Tonight we are going to follow the whole of that age, from its very first morning to its very last battle, and we are going to do it slowly, gently, without any hurry at all. The way the tide comes in over those long silver sands. This is the entire history of the Vikings, from the deep, quiet centuries before the first sail ever left a northern fjord, to the day the last great Longship king fell and the age closed behind him like water behind a ship. And we will walk through all of it together, every raid and every voyage and every strange peaceful chapter in between, so that by the time we reach the far end of the story you will most likely already be asleep, and that is exactly as it should be. So before we begin, settle yourself now into whatever stillness you have made for the night. Let your head find the soft place in the pillow that it has been looking for all day. Let the blanket settle over your shoulders with its small familiar weight, and let that weight press you down, very gently, 1 quiet inch at a time deeper into the bed. Let the lamp grow dim. Let your hands rest wherever they have fallen, and let your breathing find its own slow pace without any help from you, the way the sea finds its own rhythm against a shore, wave after wave after wave, each one a little softer than the last. There is nothing you need to do for the rest of this night. There is nowhere you need to be but here. The story will carry itself, and you have nothing to carry at all. If you enjoy these long, quiet journeys through the past, you are welcome to press the like button and to subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, because this little corner of the internet works best when it is a place people actually want to be. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments before you drift off, wherever you are in the world, because it helps other sleepless people find their way here, and there is something quietly comforting in knowing that while you lie here listening, someone on the far side of the planet is lying in the dark listening too, the two of you keeping each other a kind of distant company. Now then, let us leave that little island shining in the morning light for a while.
With its singing monks and its bending gardener and that small square shape far out on the sea, and let us do what we always do here. Let us go back.
Not a year, not a century, but all the way back before there were any Vikings at all, back before there were ships or sails or even very many people in the north. Because the truth is that you cannot understand the men and women who came out of Scandinavia at the end of the 8th century unless you first understand the long, cold, patient story of the land that made them. And that story begins, like so many of the best stories, with ice. Picture the north of Europe as it was some 12,000 years ago. There is no Denmark, no Norway, no Sweden. There are no names at all, because there is no one to do the naming. There is only the ice, a single sheet of it in places more than a mile thick, lying over the whole of Scandinavia the way a sleeping animal lies over its den, and it has been lying there so long and it is so unimaginably heavy that it has pressed the very rock of the earth down beneath it, bowed the crust of the planet like a cushion under a stone. The world is silent in a way no world has been silent since, and then, so slowly that no single lifetime could ever have noticed it, the weather turns. The summers grow a little longer. The ice begins to give way, melting back northward year by year, century by century, and as it goes it carves the land beneath it into the shapes we would recognise today, gouging out the long deep sea valleys of the Norwegian coast that will one day be called fjords, scraping the rock of Sweden bare, dropping its rubble to build the low sandy hills of Denmark, and leaving behind it a land of 10,000 lakes and skerries and islands, a land so tangled up with water that in most of it you can hardly walk a day in a straight line without getting your feet wet. Remember that, because it matters. The ice, as it dies, is drawing the map of everything that will follow. It is making a country where the easiest road will never be a road at all, but the water, and a people who learn that lesson early, learn it forever. Behind the retreating ice come the plants, mosses first, then grasses, then birch and pine and oak, a great slow green tide following the white one north. Behind the plants come the animals, reindeer and elk and red deer, bears and beavers, seals along the shores, salmon crowding the rivers in silver thousands. And behind the animals, of course, come the people, small bands of hunters drifting up from the south, with their spears and their dogs and their curiosity, following the herds along the coasts. They are not Vikings. They are nobody's ancestors in any way that would have meant anything to them. They are simply people who camp by the water's edge in the endless pale light of the northern summer, who watch the seals and learn to hunt them, who hollow out logs and stretch skins over frames to make the first small boats those waters have ever carried, and who discover, generation by generation, the one great truth of Scandinavia, which is that the sea is not the edge of the land but the heart of it, not a wall but a door. For thousands of years, that is the whole story. The hunters become fishers as well as hunters. The fishers become, very slowly, farmers too, as the knowledge of wheat and barley and cattle comes wandering up from the distant south, passed from hand to hand and valley to valley, until even in Norway, where the farmable land lies in thin green ribbons between the mountains and the water, there are little farms with little fields, and cattle standing in the summer meadows, and smoke rising from hearths in the long winter dark. The people learn to smelt bronze, trading their amber and their furs southward along routes so long that northern amber ends up in the graves of Mediterranean kings. Which means, if you pause to think about it, that the north was never really isolated at all, not even then. There were always threads running south, thin as spider silk but unbroken, carrying goods and ideas and stories in both directions across the whole width of Europe. Later the bronze gives way to iron, which the northerners learned to dig out of their own wetlands, iron made from the rusty ore that gathers among the roots of the bogs, so that even the metal of their axes and ploughs comes, in a way, out of the water. The centuries go by like clouds. Little kingdoms and chiefdoms rise and fall, leaving behind them great mounds of earth over their dead kings and stones set upright in the outlines of ships, because already, this early, the people of the north cannot imagine even death without a boat. And all this while, far to the south, Rome rises and rules and falls, and the north hears of it the way you hear thunder from a storm that never quite reaches your valley. Roman traders buy northern furs. Roman silver coins find their way into northern hoards. Young northern men serve, some of them, in Roman armies and come home with tales of cities beyond imagining, of walls and temples and streets holding more people than a whole northern kingdom. The north listens and trades and remembers and stays itself. And when Rome finally stumbles and falls and the peoples of Europe go wandering in the long confusion that follows, the north stays out of most of it, tucked up above the weather of history, farming its thin fields and sailing its tangled coasts, slowly, quietly, growing into something new. By the time we reach the 6th and 7th centuries, the shape of the Viking world is almost ready. Not the ships yet, not quite, and not the age of raids, but the world that will launch them, and it is that world, the farms and the halls and the gods and the long dark winters, that we should walk through next, at our own unhurried pace, because the Vikings were farmers long before they were ever raiders, and they were neighbours to one another long before they were ever a terror to anyone else. So come and stand, for a while, in a Scandinavian farmyard in the early 700s, a generation or two before anyone in England has ever had reason to fear a sail. It is late on a summer evening, and the light is doing that strange, generous thing it does in the north in June, refusing to leave, lying gold and level across the water long after bedtime, so that the whole world seems to be holding its breath in a permanent late afternoon. The farm sits at the head of a small fjord, where a stream comes down off the mountain through a strip of good green land perhaps 2 fields wide. At the centre of everything stands the longhouse, and it is worth taking a moment over, because for the entire age we are about to travel through, this building is the true home of the Viking world, far more than any ship. It is long and low, perhaps the length of 10 men lying head to foot, with walls of timber or turf and a roof of turf so thick and green that from the hillside above the house looks like a part of the meadow that has quietly stood up. There are no windows to speak of. Inside, one long room runs the whole length of the building, with a hearth down the middle like a spine of fire, and wide earthen benches along both walls, covered in furs and woolen blankets, where the household sits by day and sleeps by night. And household is the right word, because everyone lives here together, the farmer and his wife, their children, the grandmother, the unmarried uncle, the hired hands, the enslaved servants, and, at the far end behind a wattle partition, in the coldest months, the cattle themselves, whose warm breath helps heat the house through the winter, and whose slow shuffling and sighing in the dark is simply one of the sounds of home, the way a furnace or a refrigerator hums in ours. The smoke from the long fire rises and gathers under the roof and finds its way out through a hole above the hearth, and everything and everyone in this world smells of that smoke, of wool and wood smoke and animals and the sea, and no one notices, because it is the smell of life itself. Watch the people for a moment. The farmer is mending a wooden rake by the door, because in this world nearly everything is made of wood, and nearly every man can shape it. His wife stands at the upright loom just inside the doorway where the light falls, walking slowly back and forth as she passes the shuttle through the threads, weaving the heavy woolen cloth that clothes every back in the north. And this is worth saying plainly, the keys to the storehouses hang at her belt, because inside this house her word is law, and the law of the land backs her up. A northern wife owns her own property. She can divorce a useless husband by gathering witnesses and saying so at the door. When her husband is away trading or fishing or, in the years to come, raiding, she runs the entire farm, land and labour and accounts, for months or years at a time, and everyone simply expects her to do it well. The Viking Age, when it comes, will be carried on the shoulders of its women just as surely as on the oars of its men, and the men, to their credit, mostly knew it. Children are everywhere underfoot, chasing a goose out of the vegetable patch, carrying water up from the stream, lying on their stomachs by the fire listening to the grandmother, who is telling a story, and we will come back to her stories in a moment, because they matter more than almost anything else on this farm. Up on the hillside, sheep and goats are grazing the steep grass that no plough could ever reach, which is the whole quiet genius of northern farming. The animals turn mountains into milk and wool. Down by the water, a boy is checking the fish lines from a little rowing boat, because the fjord is the larder, cod and herring and salmon, seals for oil and skin, seabird eggs from the cliffs in spring. Nobody in this world lives from the land alone or the sea alone. Every family lives from both, one foot on the turf and one in the boat, and every child grows up with an oar in their hands as naturally as a modern child grows up with a spoon. Now this farm does not stand alone. Down the fjord there are other farms, and over the mountain there are more, and all of them together make up a district, and the free farmers of that district gather at fixed times of the year at a meeting called the Thing, which is one of the most quietly remarkable institutions in the whole medieval world. The Thing is an outdoor assembly held at a traditional spot, a plain by a river, a hillside, a ring of stones, where the free men of the district come together to settle disputes, witness marriages, make deals, and speak law. There is a law speaker whose task is to know the law by heart, all of it, and to recite a portion of it aloud each session from memory, because nothing here is written down. The law lives in living heads, passed from law speaker to law speaker like a flame from candle to candle. If two farmers quarrel over a boundary or a dead cow or an insult, they do not reach for their axes, at least not first. They bring the matter to the Thing, and their neighbours hear it and judge it, and the loser pays a fine measured in silver or in cloth or in cattle. It does not always work. Feuds happen, and northern feuds are long and cold and patient. But the idea underneath it that free men meet in the open air as equals before the law, that even a chieftain must argue his case with words in front of everyone, that is bred into these people bone deep, and they will carry it with them everywhere they go for the next 300 years, to Iceland and England and Ireland and the rivers of the East, and wherever they settle, the first thing they build is a farm, and the second thing they agree on is where the Thing will meet. Above the farmers there are chieftains and petty kings, big men with bigger halls, who hold their power not so much by birth as by generosity, and this is a thing worth lying still and thinking about. A northern lord is called a ring-giver in the old poetry, because that is his actual job. He feasts his men, he gives them arm rings of silver, cloaks, weapons, seats of honour, and in return they row his ships and fight his quarrels and make him mighty. And a lord who stops giving very quickly stops being a lord. Power in this world is a wheel that has to be kept turning. Silver in, gifts out, loyalty in, glory out, and the wheel is hungry, and there is only so much silver in Scandinavia, and you might, if you were lying comfortably in the dark thinking about it, begin to see where this is going to lead. A lord who wants to rise needs treasure that his neighbours do not control, treasure from outside, and the moment someone works out that there is a whole world of it sitting unguarded across the water, this entire patient system becomes a launching ramp. But we are not quite there yet. First, the grandmother's stories. Because before we can sail with these people, we have to know what they believe. The old woman by the fire is telling the children about the gods, and her gods are not distant or gentle. There is one-eyed Odin, the wanderer, lord of poetry and wisdom and the honoured dead, who gave one of his eyes for a single drink from the well of knowledge, which the grandmother notes approvingly was a fair price. There is Thor of the thunder, huge and red-bearded and not enormously clever, who rides across the sky in a cart pulled by goats, and whose hammer keeps the giants away. The ordinary farmer's favourite, the god you call on when the storm is over the mountain. And there is Freyja of love and plenty, and treacherous clever Loki, who is on nobody's side, not even his own, a bit like a cat that has learnt to talk. And behind all the gods, and this is the strange deep note under all northern belief, stands fate. The gods themselves are not eternal. The grandmother tells the children, calmly, the way you might mention the end of summer, that one day even the gods will fall, at the last battle at the end of the world, and they know it, and they go on anyway, and that is exactly the point. What matters, she says, is not whether you fall. Everything falls. What matters is how you stand while you are standing, because the one thing that survives everything, the one treasure moth and rust and time cannot touch, is your name, the word people say of you after you are gone. A good name outlives a man, says the old poetry, and it is almost the only thing that does. Sleep on that thought a moment, because it is the engine of the whole age to come. A people who believe that fate is fixed, and only reputation lasts, are a people who will step onto a 5-metre wide-open boat and point it at the horizon without much fuss. Because whatever happens out there was going to happen anyway, and if it goes well, the name lives. Add to that the land itself, beautiful and thin, good farms scarce, and sons many, so that younger brothers stand to inherit nothing much but their arms and their appetite. Add the long dark winters with nothing to do but sharpen tools and tell stories about famous men who went out and came back rich. Add the trading ships that already creep along the coasts, bringing southern silver and southern news of kingdoms rich beyond dreaming, and lately quarrelling among themselves. And now, into that dry kindling, let us drop the spark, because it is time to talk about the one invention that turned a scattered nation of farmers at the edge of the map into the fastest moving people on earth. It is time to talk about the ship. Every people gets one perfect tool, one invention where everything they know and everything they need meet in a single shape, and for the people of the north that tool was the Longship. It did not appear overnight. Nothing in this story appears overnight. For thousands of years the northerners had been building boats, and you can watch the idea grow, generation by generation. Like a tree adding rings. First the skin boats and dugout canoes of the hunters, then long low-rowing boats stitched and pinned from planks. Boats that could carry a dozen men along the coast, but never dared lose sight of it. Slowly the builders learn their craft's great secret, which is to build the shell first, plank by overlapping plank, each one riveted to the one below it with iron nails, and only afterwards to slip the ribs inside, light and springy, so that the finished hull is not a rigid box but a living thing, thin as a fingernail in proportion to its length, that bends and breathes and works with the sea instead of fighting it. Sailors from other traditions who later saw these hulls flexing in heavy weather were frankly horrified, and the northerners simply smiled, because that flexing was the whole idea. And then, sometime in the 7th or early 8th century, astonishingly late, the North finally adopts the one thing every other seafaring people had possessed for millennia, the sail. Why so late? Nobody quite knows. Perhaps in waters so tangled with islands and headwinds, oars simply made more sense for longer. But when the sail arrives, and the northern builders marry a broad square sheet of wool to their light, flexible, shallow hulls, something happens that had never happened anywhere before. They get a vessel that can do everything. With the wind behind her, a longship can run at speeds a fair number of modern sailing boats would respect, crossing open sea out of sight of land for days. With the sail down and the oars out, she can creep up a river barely deeper than a bathtub, because a fully loaded longship draws only about a metre of water. Which means, and it took Europe a painfully long time to understand this, that to a longship, a coastline is not a wall with a few gates called harbours, it is one long open door. And every river is a road running conveniently inland toward the nearest rich town, and she is light. A crew can pick their ship up and carry her, rollers under the keel, around a waterfall or across a neck of land from one river to the next, which will matter enormously when we get to Russia, so keep it in a corner of your drowsy mind. The ship is double-ended, bow and stern alike, so she can back off a beach as sweetly as she ran onto it. No turning, no harbour, no warning. Picture her now, drawn up on the sand in the summer light, because she is genuinely beautiful, and the people who made her knew it. Low, lean, the sweep of her sheer line like a line of calligraphy. The stem rising at each end in a proud curve that might end in a spiral or, on a warship, in a carved and gilded dragon's head, which by law had to be taken down when approaching home waters so as not to frighten the friendly spirits of the land. A rule I have always found rather touching. A nation of professional terrifiers carefully unscrewing the scary part before coming home. Her strakes are tarred dark, her sail is a great square of woolen cloth, often woven in strips of colour, and along her gunwales hang the painted shields of her crew. She carries 30 men, 60 in the greatest of her kind. And those men are her engine, her cargo, her crew, and her whole argument. And here is a thing worth resting on. There is no cabin, no deck, no shelter of any kind. The men who crossed the North Sea and, later, the open Atlantic in these boats did it sitting on their sea chests in the open air, in oiled skins, ailing when it rained, sleeping on the ballast stones among the cargo with a walrus hide rope for a pillow, eating dried fish and sour butter, drinking from a skin, navigating without compass or chart, by the sun and the stars, by the colour of the water and the set of the swell, by the flight lines of seabirds heading home in the evening, by the loom of light that unseen land throws up against the underside of clouds, and by a chant of sailing directions learned by heart from older men, steer so many days on this bearing until the mountain with the glacier stands so high on your right hand. It was a science, exact and hard won. It simply lived in heads instead of on paper. These were, and it is not really arguable, the finest seamen the world had yet produced. So there is the world, and there is the tool, and now the age can begin. And it begins quietly, the way an avalanche begins with one pebble. Through the middle years of the 8th century, Scandinavian traders are a familiar sight in the market towns that have sprouted around the North Sea, selling furs and amber and walrus ivory, buying silver and cloth and wine. Those traders come home with more than goods. They come home with charts in their heads, harbours, tides, town gates, market days, and with gossip, and the gossip of the 1780s of that world, so to speak, is very interesting indeed. The great southern empire of the Franks is mighty but busy, its attention turned inward and southward. England is not one kingdom, but 4, and they do not like each other. Ireland is a patchwork of small kings raiding one another energetically. And everywhere, along every coast, and up every river, sit the monasteries. Now from inside Christian Europe, a monastery is a house of prayer. From the deck of a northern trading ship, looking in with pagan eyes, the same building presents a rather different aspect. Here is a large, rich, totally unfortified compound, conveniently located on an island or a headland with excellent beach access, inhabited exclusively by unarmed men who have taken vows not to fight, and containing, by design, the concentrated treasure of an entire kingdom. Gold and silver vessels, jewelled book covers, coined money, fine cloth, plus well-fed captives who can be sold or ransomed. There is no getting around what that looks like to a sea-going people with a silver-hungry social system and no particular reverence for the god in question. It looks like a bank with the door propped open. For a generation, nothing happens. Trade goes on, the North watches, and then someone, some chieftain on some fjord, whose name we will never know, does the arithmetic out loud in his hall one winter, 3 ships, 90 men, 1 summer, and no one to stop us, and in the spring they go. There are a few first whispers in the record of violent misunderstanding on the coast of southern England, where a royal official rowed down to meet 3 strange ships, insisted the newcomers register at the royal manor like proper traders, and was killed on the beach for his trouble, a scuffle here, a rumour there. And then comes the morning we have already seen, early June 793. The tide low, the sands shining, the monks at their morning office, the young brother among his beans, and that small square shape on the horizon that might be a cloud, except that now there are 3 of them, and they are growing, and they are coming in fast on the making tide, long and low and full of men. What happened next on Lindisfarne went through Europe like a crack through glass. The ships took the beach at a run, and the men who came over the bows moved with horrible practicality, straight up the sand to the church, because they had clearly been told exactly where everything was. The altar plate, the jewelled shrine, the chests, gone. Some of the brothers were cut down where they stood, some driven into the sea, some taken for the slave markets. And then the ships were gone, hull down over the horizon before any help could even hear the news, and the age had begun. To us, at this distance, it is one raid on one small island. To Europe it was something like a hole torn in the sky. Lindisfarne was not any monastery, it was one of the holiest places in the Christian West, and the news ran everywhere. At the court of the great Frankish emperor, the most famous English scholar of the age, a man from exactly that northern coast, sat down and wrote home in open anguish, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. It was not thought possible that such an inroad from the sea could be made." It was not thought possible. Hold that phrase, because it is the key to the whole first act of this story. Europe's entire mental map had land in the middle and water at the edges, and the sea was simply the place where the map stopped. The northerners had the opposite map. The sea was the middle, the highway, the connecting thing, and every coast on it was a suburb. For the next 200 years, Europe would be learning, slowly and expensively, to read the map the northern way. And the men in the ships, who had just discovered that the arithmetic worked even better than promised, were about to teach the lesson very thoroughly indeed. But that is for the next part of our story, and there is no hurry at all. The 3 ships are away east with the sunset behind them. The sea has closed over their wake, and on the shining sands of the little island the tide is coming quietly in, the way it did before and the way it will after, covering the footprints, filling the causeway, wrapping the holy ground up in water for the night, as if the sea itself were tucking the wounded island in. And somewhere far to the north, in 100 firelit halls, a story is beginning to be told, and the name of every man in it is about to live for a very long time. The news of that first great raid ran through the north as fast as it ran through the south, and in the north it was heard rather differently. In the south it was sacrilege. In the north it was a business report, and the report said that the thing worked. The following summer the ships came back, more of them, and hit another famous monastery down the coast, and the summer after that they rounded the top of Scotland and found the holy island of Iona, the mother house of all the monasteries of the Celtic north, sitting on its little green shelf of land, facing the open Atlantic, with once again no wall and no weapons. And they emptied it, and they would come back to Iona again and again in the years that followed, until the surviving monks finally packed up the relics of their founder and moved inland to Ireland, where the ships could not follow, which, as we will see, was optimistic of them. Because Ireland was next, and Ireland was in some ways the perfect country for this new kind of war. It was rich in exactly the portable ways the raiders liked, cattle and church metal and people, and it was divided among dozens of small kings who could no more combine against a seaborne enemy than a field of cats can combine against the rain. Through the early 800s the pattern settles in, and it is worth lying back and watching it work, because it is a system, and a horribly elegant one. The ships appear at dawn, out of the empty sea, at a place that cannot possibly have expected them, because no one can watch every mile of coast. The men are ashore and moving before the cattle have finished lifting their heads. They know what they want: silver, food, captives, speed, and they are gone again on the same tide, and by the time the local king has gathered his warriors and come hurrying down to the shore, there is nothing on the beach but footprints and smoke, and the ships are a smudge on the horizon 3 headlands away, choosing their next stop. Fighting them was like fencing with someone who is allowed to become invisible between strokes, and every summer the ships came a little further, stayed a little longer, dared a little more, up the rivers now, to monasteries that had thought themselves safely inland. And then one autumn, instead of going home with the season, some of the crews did a new thing, a small thing that changed everything. They beached their ships in a sheltered estuary, threw a bank and a palisade around them, and stayed the winter. The Irish annals call these fortified ship camps long forts, and you can feel the change in the record. The raiders have stopped being weather, something that comes and goes with the seasons, and started being neighbours. Something that is simply there, permanently, with its own address. And the most important of those addresses, founded in the year 841 at a black tidal pool, where the river Liffey meets the sea, a place the Irish called the Dark Pool, in their tongue Dublin, grew from a ship camp into a market, and from a market into the biggest slave port and trading town in the western seas, and it is still there today, and still called Dublin, and it is not the only one. Wexford, Waterford, Cork, Limerick, every one of them began as a Viking beachhead, which produces the odd historical footnote that the people who never built a single town of their own in Ireland before they arrived ended up founding very nearly all of Ireland's oldest cities. The raiders themselves, it is time to say plainly who they were, because the horned helmet cartoon has done its work on all of us, and it is nearly all wrong. Starting with the horns, which are an invention of 19th century opera costume designers, and would have been, if you think about it for even a moment while falling asleep, a spectacularly stupid thing to wear in a fight. A pair of handles bolted to your head. A real raiding crew was a cross-section of ordinary northern manhood, the younger sons we met earlier with no land coming to them, ambitious farmers filling the summer between sowing and harvest, a blacksmith, a couple of chieftains' sons hunting reputation, men in wool and leather with spears and round-painted shields and one good axe, and if they were lucky a helmet, plain and round. And if they were very lucky a mail shirt, and among them, the sagas insist and modern graves quietly confirm, at least occasionally a woman with a sword, though how often, we will honestly never know. They called what they were doing going Viking. The word seems to have meant something like raiding voyage, an activity, not a people, a job you did for a season or a decade. And here is the detail that is easy to lose and important to keep. Most northerners never did it at all. For every man in a ship there were dozens at home milking cows and cutting hay and arguing at the thing, and the trading ships went on trading the whole time, sometimes to the very same coasts the raiders were burning, and a merchant might sell you cloth in the spring and sack your neighbour in the autumn, or the other way about. It was, for the men in the ships, not a war and certainly not a crusade. It was the silver wheel we talked about, spinning faster and faster. Because now the ring-givers had found a source of rings that never seemed to run dry. But we should not let the wheel's elegance soften what it ground. The cargo those ships carried home was not only altarplate, it was people. The slave trade was not a sideline of the Viking Age, it was one of its main engines, and it is the part the romantic books leave out. Captives taken on an Irish beach or an English riverbank were roped together in the hold, carried to Dublin or to the markets of the north, and sold, some to northern farms, where they became the thralls we glimpsed at the dark end of the Longhouse, and many onward, along routes we will travel later in the night, all the way to the silver-rich markets of the east, so that there were children born by the Liffey who grew old by the Caspian Sea. Europe called the raiders heathen wolves, and from the deck of the ships the answer would have been a shrug. The strong take, the clever sell, fate decides, and it is precisely that shrug, that total unsentimental clarity, that made them so hard to stop, and no one for a long time could stop them. Kings tried. The Irish won battles now and then, and lost more. The English kingdoms, still busy disliking each other, paid and prayed, and rebuilt. In the great empire across the Channel, the aging Emperor Charlemagne, master of most of the Western world, is said to have stood at a window late in his life and watched northern ships prowling off his coast, and wept. Not from fear of them, he said, but from grief, because he could see what was coming for his grandchildren. He was right to weep, as emperors usually are when they finally notice something. His empire had one strong pair of hands on it. The ships in the offing were in effect waiting for those hands to let go, and in the year 814, they did. Charlemagne died and was buried in his chapel in the north of his empire, and his heirs began, almost at once, the traditional activity of heirs everywhere, which is to fight each other for the inheritance, and while they fought, the coasts and the rivers of the richest land in Western Europe lay open like an unlatched door, and out in the northern sea. With the patience of men who have been watching a fruit ripen, the ships began to gather. What they did to the land of the Franks in the generation that followed is the next chapter of our story, and it is the chapter where raiding grows up into something much bigger. So let the fire settle a little, and we will cross the sea together, southward this time, to the wide green mouth of a river called the Seine. The empire of the Franks, in the years after the old emperor's death, was the greatest prize in the Western world, and it was busy taking itself apart. Charlemagne's son inherited the whole of it, and Charlemagne's grandsons went to war with their father and with each other over the pieces, and the wars of the Frankish princes did the raiders' work for them more thoroughly than any fleet could have, stripping the coasts of defenders, calling the counts and their armed men away inland to fight other Franks, and teaching every ambitious man in the empire that the real game was at court, not on some grey beach watching for sails. The sails, naturally, drew their conclusions. Through the 820s and 30s, the raids on the Frankish coast swell year by year, and the raiders discover the empire's beautiful weakness, its rivers. The Seine, the Loire, the Somme, the Rhine, broad, slow, navigable highways running from the sea straight into the soft interior of the richest country in the West, lined with towns and abbeys that had grown fat in 2 centuries of Frankish peace. And not one of them, not one, defended against attack from the water, because attack from the water was not a thing that happened to inland towns, until suddenly it was the main thing that happened to inland towns. The great trading port of Dorestad on the Rhine, one of the busiest markets in northern Europe, was sacked so many times in a single generation, 4 times in 4 consecutive years at one stretch, that historians mostly stopped counting, and the town itself eventually gave up and faded away, which is a rather haunting thing for a town to do, simply to be raided out of existence. And then, in the year 845, comes the raid that turns the whole business into legend. A fleet of 120 ships enters the mouth of the Seine in March, thousands of men, led, the old stories say, by a chieftain called Ragnar, whom later saga writers would inflate into Ragnar Lothbrok, Ragnar Hairy Breeches, the most famous Viking who may or may not have entirely existed, a man so wrapped in legend that historians handle him the way you might handle a beautiful old sword that is possibly a stage prop, respectfully and at arm's length. But the fleet was real, and what it did was real. It came up the river burning as it went, brushed aside the force the king of the West Franks sent against it, and on Easter Sunday of all days in the year, it reached and sacked Paris, which was then a modest town crowded onto an island in the river, but a town with the name it has now, and the name is rather the point. The raiders had just demonstrated that nowhere, absolutely nowhere, was out of reach. The king, Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, did his arithmetic, counted his other wars, and paid the fleet to go away £7,000 of silver, a sum so large it had to be scraped together from church treasuries across the kingdom. And Ragnar's fleet took the silver, and went away, exactly as agreed, and here we should pause, lying comfortably in the dark, to appreciate the mechanism that has just clicked into place, because Europe will be living inside it for 200 years. The payment worked. That is the terrible thing. The fleet really left. But fleets, it turns out, talk to each other, and the news that the Franks would pay silver by the ton to be left alone went through the northern world like the smell of baking through a house, and the result was entirely predictable to everyone except, apparently, the men doing the paying. More fleets came. The Franks paid again, and again, and again at least 13 enormous official payments over the following decades, each one advertised as the last, each one funding, on the northern end, the fitting out of next season's even larger fleet. A payment to make Vikings go away is, seen from the Viking side, simply a raid with no fighting in it, wonderfully efficient, and the silver worked exactly like a modern review left by a satisfied customer, which is a habit that tends to age badly. To be fair to the Franks, and to the English who would soon inherit the same dilemma and give the payments their lasting name, Danegeld, the money was not always stupid. Silver bought time, and time could be spent, and the cleverer kings spent it. Charles the Bold, whatever his hair situation, eventually ordered fortified bridges built low across the rivers, span after span, specifically to bar the ships from the interior, and walls rebuilt around towns, and slowly in the Frankish lands the arithmetic began to shift. But the deeper change was this: the raiders had stopped going home. Fleets began wintering at the river mouths, on convenient islands, exactly the long-fought trick from Ireland, and a fleet that winters is no longer a visit, it is an occupation, and its men start looking around at the green country with a different eye. Less what can we carry, more what could we keep. Hold that thought, because it is the seed of the next act, and of one of the strangest bargains in European history, which we will come to before the night is much older. But first the story requires us to look north again, across the Channel, because in the year 865, the biggest thought anyone in the north had yet thought was thought about England, and England was about to have the worst decade in its history. Picture England as it then was, and notice first that there is no England. There are 4 kingdoms on the one island, Northumbria in the north, proud and old and just now busy with a civil war over its throne, which is the kind of timing history loves. Mercia in the middle, East Anglia bulging out to the east, and Wessex in the south, and they share a language and a church and a long habit of fighting one another. And against the ships they have so far fared no better than anyone else, paying here, losing there, rebuilding everywhere. For 70 years they have endured the summer pattern, raid, ransom, departure. What comes in 865 is not the summer pattern. What comes is an army, the biggest northern force ever assembled, thousands of men in hundreds of ships, Danes mostly, with crews from across the whole northern world, an army with no intention of leaving, ever, and the English chroniclers, who had a gift for the plain phrase that says everything, wrote it down as the Great Heathen Army, and the sagas, spinning their beautiful doubtful yarn across the same facts, say it was led by the sons of Ragnar himself, come to avenge their father, whom an English king was said to have thrown into a pit of snakes, where he died composing poetry, as one does. The snakes may be doubted. The sons were real enough, hard, famous men with names like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdown, and their army did not raid. It conquered. It landed in East Anglia, took horses from the terrified locals in exchange for a temporary peace, and rode north. And in the year 866 it took York, the greatest city of the north, while the 2 rival kings of Northumbria were preoccupied with their civil war. The rivals patched their quarrel and jointly stormed their own city to take it back, and died together in the wreck of the attempt, and Northumbria, the kingdom of holy islands and scholars that had produced the finest learning in the West, simply stopped after 2.5 centuries, one of the 4 lamps of England put out. The army turned south. East Anglia's young King Edmund refused, the story goes, to serve heathen masters, and was killed for it, tied to a tree, the legend says, and shot full of arrows like a hedgehog, and within a generation. And this is one of the strangest and loveliest turns in the whole tale. The Danes who settled his kingdom were themselves minting coins stamped with the name of St. Edmund, honouring as a saint the king their own fathers had killed, because conquest is a blunt instrument, but belonging is a patient one. Mercia bought the army off, which by now you will recognise as feeding the fire to keep warm, and by the early 870s 2 of the 4 kingdoms were gone outright, a third was paying tribute on its knees, and the army stood at last on the border of the 4th, the southern kingdom Wessex, licking its lips. And Wessex, at precisely that moment, with the enemy at the gate and the whole future of everything England would ever be balanced on a knife's edge. Did what no scriptwriter would dare, it buried its king, and handed the crown to his last surviving brother, the fourth son, a bookish, anxious, chronically unwell young man of about 22 named Alfred, and nobody, not the Danes, not the Saxons, possibly not even Alfred, thought he had the slightest chance. He is the only king in all of English history to be called the Great, but that is getting ahead of our story, and the night is long, and the marshes are waiting. For 7 years the young King of Wessex fought the great army to a bloody, expensive standstill. 9 pitched battles in his first year alone, victories that settled nothing, and defeats that nearly settled everything, and payments too. Because Alfred paid Danegeld like everyone else when the alternative was ruin, whatever the schoolbooks prefer to remember. The army would withdraw, digest some other part of England, and return. And in midwinter of the year 878, in the dead season when armies were supposed to be in their camps and kings at their feasts, the Danish king Guthrum broke every rule of the game and struck straight at Alfred himself, at his royal estate where the court lay celebrating the 12th night of Christmas. It very nearly worked. The court was scattered in the dark, the kingdom's leadership was dead, captured or fled by morning, and organised Wessex simply ceased to exist between one night and the next day. The last English kingdom was over, bar the announcements. Except that the king was not dead, and he was not abroad. Alfred went into the marshes. In the far west of his drowned kingdom there is a low wet country of reeds and alder and winding black water, and in the heart of it an island of firm ground called Athelney, reachable only by boat or by one hidden causeway. And there, through the cold end of that winter, the King of Wessex lived as a fugitive in his own land, with his family and a few dozen loyal men. Raiding his own occupied kingdom for supplies, king, in practical terms, of several acres of mud. This is the bottom of the story, England's and Alfred's both. And the English knew it, which is why their most beloved legend attaches to exactly this moment. The story of the peasant woman who, not recognising the shabby refugee by her fire, set him to watch her cakes baking on the hearth, and scolded him up and down when he let them burn, his head being, understandably, elsewhere, and the King of Wessex sat and took the scolding meekly. Which is of course the point of the story, the great brought low and schooled in humility at a cottage hearth before being raised up again. Because raised up he was. What Alfred did from Athelney that spring is the reason his statue stands today. He did not flee abroad, as kings in his position routinely did. He sent out word, quietly, along the loyalty networks of his shires, and in the 7th week after Easter, at a landmark stone on the edge of the High Downs, the fighting men of 3 shires came to him, thousands of them, out of an occupied country, at a summons that could have been a trap, and the sources say that when they saw him alive they greeted him as a man come back from the dead. 2 days later he brought Guthrum's army to battle at a place called Eddington, an old-fashioned, unclever wall of shields, pushing battle of exactly the kind the Danes were supposed to win, and he broke them, drove them 14 miles back into their fortress, sat down around it, and starved them for 2 weeks until Guthrum asked for terms. And now watch closely, because what Alfred does with his victory is the cleverest thing in the whole English half of this story. He does not massacre the army, which he probably could not have managed anyway. He does not simply take hostages and silver and watch the same fleet come back in 3 years, which was the pattern of the entire age. He asks for something no one had asked for before. He asks for Guthrum himself at the font. 3 weeks later the Danish king came to Alfred and was baptized a Christian, with Alfred standing as his godfather, which made the two of them, by the logic of the age, kin. And then the 2 kings sat down together for 12 days of feasting and gift-giving, and hammered out a treaty that drew a line across the map of England, from the Thames up the old Roman road, everything north and east of the line to be Guthrum's, everything south and west Alfred's, and Guthrum took his army off to East Anglia and settled it there, and, the astonishing part, more or less kept the deal, minting his coins under his new baptismal name, until he died in his bed years later, a Christian king of a settled land, which is not the ending anyone would have predicted for the man who broke Christmas. The land north and east of that line, where Danish law ran, would come to be called the Danelaw. And it is time to lie back and let the raiding smoke clear. Because what happened inside the Danelaw over the next 2 generations is, in its quiet way, the biggest event of the whole age, bigger than any battle. The army parcelled out the land, and the men we last saw coming over a gunwale with axes put the axes in the roof beams and became farmers, which is what most of them had been all along, and they sent home for wives or married local women, and the 2 peoples, who could half understand each other's languages to begin with, settled down side by side to the great slow business of becoming the same people. You can still see them there today, if you know how to look. Every English place name ending in by Grimsby, Derby, Whitby is a Danish farm, by being simply the Danish word for settlement. Every thorp a Danish outlying hamlet, and there are hundreds upon hundreds of them across the old Danelaw, a census of settlement written on the road signs. And the language, this is the part I find genuinely moving. English did not just borrow decorative words from Danish, it borrowed the plain load-bearing furniture of speech, sky, skin, leg, egg, window, knife, husband, fellow, law, wrong, happy, ugly, and, most intimate of all, the pronouns they, them and their. And you do not lend a neighbour your pronouns over a garden fence. That only happens when 2 peoples have merged so completely, hearth by hearth and marriage by marriage, that the children can no longer tell you which of their grandparents came in the ships. Meanwhile, south of the line, Alfred spent the rest of his life making sure the bottom of the marsh could never happen again, and his to-do list built a nation. He ringed his kingdom with some 30 fortified towns, burhs, spaced so that no one lived more than a day's march from safety, each with its garrison quota worked out in a surviving document. Each a market as well as a fort, and many of them, Oxford, Winchester among them, are living towns today whose street plans still remember his surveyors. He reorganised the army into rotating halves, so that one shift was always in the field while the other minded the farms, raiding season no longer meaning harvest ruin. He built big ships to meet the raiders at sea, which worked imperfectly, but the idea had arrived and would not leave. An Englishman would be calling Alfred the founder of the navy for 1,000 years, and then, with the swords stacked, this defended king did the thing no warrior king in his century dreamed of doing. He decided his people's real poverty was of the mind, learning having been burned out of the land with the monasteries, and so the King of Wessex, in his 40s, with a kingdom to run, sat down and learned Latin, and personally translated the books he thought his people needed most into English, philosophy, history, theology, adding his own thoughts as he went, and ordered that the sons of free men be taught to read English, and began the keeping of a great year-by-year chronicle of English history that would be kept up, in one monastery or another, for 2.5 centuries. Somewhere in his writings he left one sentence that can stand for the whole man. I desired to live worthily as long as I lived, and to leave after my life, to the men who should come after me, the memory of me in good works. He died in his early 50s, in the year 899, having held the door. His children would walk through it. His formidable daughter Aethelflaed, ruling Mercia in her own right, Lady of the Mercians, led armies and built fortresses, and took back Danish towns in a campaign historians still admire for its patience, and his son and grandsons pushed the line north, burh by burh, year by year, not so much conquering the Danelaw as absorbing it. Since by now the Danish farmers of Derby had roughly the same interest in peace and the price of wool as the English farmers of Oxford, until in the year 927 Alfred's grandson Athelstan took York itself and was crowned, for the first time in history, King of all England, a country that had not existed when the great army landed, and in a way exists because it did. The hammer that had broken the 4 kingdoms having welded the survivors into one. And there we may leave England for a while, whole, wary, and watching the sea, because far out on that sea, while all these armies marched, something entirely different had been going on, something with no battles in it at all, and it is time to follow the quieter ships, the ones that turned their bows not south toward the silver, but west, toward the empty ocean, to find out what was on the other side of the weather. Though before we leave England to her hard-won wholeness, the north of her had one last flourish to make, and it is too good a story to sleep past, because the Kingdom of York did not go quietly, and its final king was perhaps the most gorgeously Viking figure in the whole English chapter, a man whose name alone is a saga. Eric Bloodaxe. He was a son of Harold Fairhair, that same hard-handed unifier of Norway whose reach had helped fill Iceland, and Eric had been briefly King of Norway after his father having thinned out. The sagas allege, and his nickname does not trouble to deny, a number of his many brothers on the way to the throne, until the surviving brothers and their friends made Norway too warm even for him. And he took to the sea in the grand old manor, a king-errant with a fleet, a formidable queen, Gunhild, whom the sagas paint as half politician and half sorceress, which is generally saga language for cleverer than the men around her, and a following of hard cases, and this royal storm cloud drifted west about the northern sea until it settled, twice, on the throne of York, where the Danish and Norse settlers of Northumbria, chafing under the new kings of all England, twice took Eric as their own king, and twice, when the pressure came on, dropped him again. York's merchants having, as merchants do, a keen sense of the way the wind was setting. And it was during those years, the saga says, that there took place in York one of the most famous scenes in northern literature, for there came to that court, shipwrecked on the Humber coast, of all the men in the world, Egil Skallagrimsson of Iceland, the greatest poet of the age and Eric's bitterest personal enemy, a huge, ugly, wolf-grey man who had killed, among a long list of others, the king's own son, and cursed the king besides with a horse's skull raised on a pole, and Egil, finding himself thrown by the sea into the one hall in the world where his death was most warmly desired, did the only thing left to do, which was the extraordinary thing. He walked into York, into the king's hall, and put his head, literally, at the king's mercy. Gunhild, reasonably enough, wanted that head off before supper, but Eric's counsellor, who was Egil's friend, won the poet one night's stay of execution, and proposed an old and honoured way out. Let the condemned man buy his head with a poem, and so, while the king slept, Egil sat up in a locked room composing, in the exacting court metre, 20 stanzas in praise of Eric Bloodaxe. Hindered part of the night, the saga cannot resist adding, by a swallow twittering at the window, who was very possibly the queen in another shape. And in the morning, before the whole court, with his life on the metre, Egil stood and delivered it, a rolling, clanging poem in praise of a king he loathed, the sword storm, the wound gulls, the generous hand, every gilded convention polished to a blaze, and Eric Bloodaxe sat and listened to his enemy praise him magnificently in front of everyone, and when it was done the king, trapped between vengeance and the one thing stronger than vengeance in that world, the glory of being the kind of king poems like that are true of, let him go, head and all. And the poem has been called the head ransom ever since, and men have argued for 1,000 years over whether it was the verse that saved Egil or the politics, which is exactly the kind of argument both Egil and Eric would have enjoyed. It could not last, of course. None of Eric's arrangements ever lasted, and in the year 954 the men of York made their final calculation, and Eric Bloodaxe, twice king of Norway's memory and twice king of York, rode out over the high Pennine moors and was met at a bleak pass called Stainmore, where the old Roman road crosses the roof of England, by an ambush arranged with the connivance of the very men who had lately cheered him, and there the last Viking king on English soil was cut down in the heather, betrayed, outnumbered, and, one rather suspects, not surprised. And a poem composed for his widow imagines the doors of Valhalla being flung wide, and the dead heroes asking why the benches are being strewn for so great a guest, and Odin himself answering that kings are coming, and when Eric is asked, arriving, why he comes dead to the hall, he answers, with a last dry shrug of the whole heroic age, because the witches were against me, and with him the separate kingdom of York ended forever, folded quietly into England, though the city itself sailed on entirely unbothered by the passing of its kings, because Jorvik, as its people called it, had become by then the great boom town of the English north, and the diggers of our own age going down through the wet black earth under a street still called Coppergate, the street of the cup-makers, found it perfectly preserved in the airless mud, whole house plots of the 10th century, wattle walls still standing knee-high, workshops with the wood shavings still curled on the floors, leather shoes by the hundred, wooden bowls, silk from Byzantium and a cowrie shell from the Red Sea, and a coin, 1 dirham, minted in Samarkand, lying in a Yorkshire backyard, the whole web of the age gathered under one English street. And they found the combs, of course, always the combs, and even, preserved as only waterlogged deposits can preserve, the unmistakable evidence of what the people of Jorvik had for dinner, which I will leave discreetly in its display case, noting only that archaeology is not a romantic science, and the sum of it all is that by the middle of the 900s the descendants of the great army were simply northern English townsfolk, buying and selling in 6 languages, wearing York-made shoes and Baghdad silver, their king's sagas already turning into stories told over the workbench. And that is how empires actually end, not always at a Stainmore, more often at a Coppergate, in the pleasant, unremarkable noise of people getting on with it, and now with York humming contentedly behind us, we really may go down to the shore, where the quieter ships are waiting, the ones that turned their bows not south toward the silver, but west toward the open ocean and the setting sun, to find out what was on the other side of the weather. The westward story begins gently, stepping stone by stepping stone. The islands north of Scotland came first, Shetland and Orkney, green, treeless, scattered with the mysterious stone towers of earlier peoples, and so temptingly close to Norway that a ship with a fair wind could raise them in a day and a night. Norwegian farmers settled them early and thoroughly, so thoroughly that the islands would speak a Norse language into the 18th century, and still, today, hold the most Scandinavian blood in Britain. And from Orkney the stepping stones led on, west and south to the Hebrides and the Isle of Man, north and west to the Faroes, the Sheep Islands, halfway out into the Atlantic, where the settlers found grass, seabirds and almost nothing else, and stayed anyway, and their descendants are there now, still raising sheep on the same slopes. And then comes the leap. The old stories preserve the moment with the charm of an anecdote, a trader bound for the Faroes, blown wildly off course by a storm, days of grey water, and then, filling the horizon where no land should be, a coast of black mountains and white glaciers running on, and he did not stop to explore, being a sensible man with a cargo. But he came home and talked, and others went to look. One of them, a Norwegian called Floki, took livestock and settled in for a trial year, lost his cattle to the brutal winter because he had spent the autumn fishing instead of haymaking, a mistake exactly one generation of settlers would make exactly once, climbed a mountain in the spring, looked north into a fjord still choked with drift ice, and named the whole country in disgust. Iceland, which has to be counted among history's least effective pieces of branding, because within a couple of years of the news spreading, the ships were streaming west. It was the 870s, and the timing was no accident. In Norway, a hard-handed king called Harald Fairhair was doing something new, forcing all the little kingdoms of the fjords under one crown, his own, and for every chieftain who bent the knee there was another who preferred, in the fine phrase of the age, to take his family, his followers, his livestock and his freedom somewhere the king's arm did not reach. And suddenly there was a somewhere, an entire empty country, 4 weeks' sail out in the ocean, first come, first served. Empty is the word, and it is worth pausing on, because it makes Iceland one of the strangest experiments in human history. Aside from a scattering of Irish hermit monks who had rowed out there seeking solitude, and who, upon the arrival of several thousand Norse neighbours, in the driest joke of the era, promptly left, the land had no one. No natives to displace, no kings to fight, no history, no ghosts. For the only time in the entire human story until the modern age, a whole nation was built from an empty page, and we know how they did it almost hour by hour, because their descendants became the most compulsive writers of the Middle Ages and set the whole thing down, family by family, farm by farm, in a book called the Book of Settlements. The settlers claimed land by old ritual, carrying fire around a territory in a day's walk, or throwing overboard, as they closed the coast, the carved wooden pillars of the family high seat, and building where the sea brought them ashore, letting the gods choose the address. Within 60 years the good land was taken, tens of thousands of people, Norse chieftains and farmers, with, the genetics now tell us plainly, a great many Irish and Scottish wives and thralls among them, so that the Icelandic nation was Celtic on its mother's side from the start, and then, in the year 930, with the country full, the chieftains did the most northern thing imaginable. Rather than crown a king, they founded a republic. Every summer, on a plain in the southwest where a great rift wall of volcanic rock makes a natural amphitheatre, the whole country rode in for 2 weeks to the Althing, the assembly of everyone. Part parliament, part supreme court, part national fair, marriages brokered, sagas told, ale drunk, lawsuits fought, and the law itself recited aloud from the law rock by the elected law speaker, 1/3 each year from memory. There was no king, no army, no police, no executive whatsoever, just the law and the willingness of neighbours to enforce it, a system so alarmingly pure that political philosophers have been arguing about it ever since, and it ran, with famous creaks and bloody feuds, for over 300 years, and the Althing itself, transformed, sits still, which lets the Icelanders make the entirely defensible claim of possessing the oldest parliament on earth. Life on the island was never easy, no grain to speak of, no timber for shipbuilding, winters that ate the unready, but it was free, and in the long dark of those winters, crowded into the firelit halls with the wind trying the roof, the Icelanders polished the one inexhaustible resource they had brought with them, words, and became the memory of the entire northern world, and everything, very nearly, that we have spent tonight retelling, the gods and the ring-givers, Ragnar and his sons, the settlement itself, survives because Icelandic farmers 3 centuries later wrote it down by lamplight. And when we finally reach the end of our story, I will want to come back to that, because it may be the Vikings' most surprising legacy of all. But the ocean is not finished with us yet, because Iceland, it turns out, was not the last stepping stone. In the year 982, a hot-tempered settler named Eric the Red, whose family had already left Norway over a small matter of some killings, was outlawed from Iceland for 3 years over a further small matter of some further killings. Eric's biography being the kind where you learn not to ask follow-up questions, and rather than wait out his exile somewhere sensible, he pointed his ship at a rumour, a coast someone had once glimpsed far to the west, and spent his 3 years exploring an enormous new land of deep fjords under a wall of inland ice, and came back not chastened but glowing, with the instincts of a property developer, and named the place, with a straight face, Greenland, on the reasoning, which the sagas state outright, that people would be more likely to move there if it had an attractive name. And it worked. 25 ships sailed west with him, 14 arrived, and for the next 4.5 centuries, and stop on that number a moment, 4.5 centuries longer than the United States has existed, there was a Norse Greenland, 2 settlements of farms in the sheltered fjords of the far southwest, a few thousand people at their height, with churches, a monastery, eventually their own bishop, paying their tithes to Rome in walrus ivory, which was their treasure, hunted far to the north and traded to Europe for the iron and timber the land could not give. The most remote outpost of the whole European world, hanging on the very rim of the map. And one more time, the rim moved. Around the year 1000, a trader bound for Greenland overshot in fog and sighted forested coasts no European had ever seen, and did not land, cargo again, and again the talk did its work. And it was Eric the Red's own son, Leif, called the Lucky, who bought that very ship, gathered a crew of 35, and went to look. What he found, sailing south and west, he named as he went with a merchant's plain labels, a land of flat stones, a land of woods, and then a gentler country of meadows and rivers thick with the biggest salmon anyone had seen, where the winter was so mild the cattle could nearly graze outdoors, and where one of his crew famously found grapes growing wild, and so Leif called it Vinland, Wineland, and wintered there and came home with a cargo of timber and stories. Others followed, his brothers, and then a substantial expedition under a trader called Thorfinn Karlsefni. 3 ships, well over 100 people, women as well as men, livestock, the full colonial kit, and among them Eric's daughter, and in that little settlement on the American shore a boy called Snorri was born, the first European child born in the New World, 500 years almost to the year before that Italian gentleman got the credit. It did not last. The land was already owned. The native people of the coast, whom the Norse called Skraelings, were numerous, capable, and after early wary trading, furs for red cloth and milk, entirely willing to fight. And the arithmetic that had carried the northerners across the whole ocean now ran, for once the other way, a handful of colonists at the end of a supply line 4 weeks long against a whole peopled continent, and after a few bloody seasons the Norse did the unsentimental Norse thing, weighed the trouble against the timber, and sailed home. Vinland faded into a story, kept alive in 2 sagas and a few Icelandic annal entries, and for 900 years the learned world filed it beside the pit of snakes, a fine tale. Until in the 1960s a Norwegian couple, following the sailing directions in the sagas themselves, dug into some grassed-over house mounds at a place called Lons Ås Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland, and found the turf halls, the boat sheds, the iron smithy, and a little bronze cloak pin of unmistakable Norse type, and the tale quietly moved shelves, from legend to archaeology. They had done it. In open boats, without compass or chart, by swell and star and seabird, the farmers of the fjords had linked Norway to North America, stepping stone by stepping stone, and the wonderful, sleepy truth of it is that no single one of them ever knew the size of what they had done. Each ship only ever went 1 stone further than the last. Which is, when you think about it, how everything large is actually accomplished. 1 stone, then the next, then sleep, then the next. And before we turn to the last great arm of the northern world, let us spend a little while somewhere gentler than any battlefield and stranger than any legend, in the market towns. Because if you could travel back yourself and stand in the Viking Age for 1 single day, you would learn more truth in a market than in 100 raids. And the north had markets that were the wonder of everyone who saw them. The greatest of them sat at the neck of the Danish peninsula, at the head of a narrow fjord on the Baltic side, a town called Hedeby, the Heath settlement. And it existed for the most Viking of all reasons, geography plus arithmetic. For at that spot the land between the Baltic and the North Sea narrows to a few miles of low country, so that cargoes could be hauled across the isthmus from sea to sea, sparing ships the long dangerous beat around the storm-swept tip of Jutland. And where cargoes must be hauled, tolls can be charged, and where tolls are charged, kings take an interest, and so Hedeby grew behind its earthen rampart into the biggest town in all Scandinavia. Which meant, let us be honest about northern urban scale, perhaps 1,500 or 2,000 souls. A village by the standards of Constantinople, and the busiest place most northerners would ever see in their lives. Walk it for a moment in the morning. The streets are planked with split timber over the mud, and they thump underfoot like a ship's deck. The houses stand gable end to the lanes, wattle and plank, each in its fenced plot. Smoke seeping through the roofs, and down at the shore the jetties run out into the shallows on posts, with ships nosed in stern first the whole length of them, a fat-bellied cargo gnar from Norway unloading soapstone bowls and whetstones and barrels of dried cod, a slim boat from the Slavic coast with amber and wax, a Frisian trader with jugs of Rhine wine and bolts of fine cloth, and between them the gulls conducting their eternal audit. In the lanes the workshops are already loud, the comb makers sawing antler into fine teeth, and it is a humbling fact of archaeology that no single object turns up in Viking towns more often than the comb, these terrifying pirates being, the evidence insists, obsessive about their hair, the bead makers winding hot glass, blue and amber gold, the bronze casters with their little clay moulds turning out cloak pins by the dozen, and, in one corner and another, the silversmiths with their scales, because here is the thing to understand about money in the north. For most of the age there was none, not really. No state coin a northerner trusted at face value anyway. Silver passed by weight alone. And every trader carried the little folding scales we have met before, and any silver would do, a Baghdad dirham, a Frankish penny, half a brooch, an arm ring chopped into pieces, what the diggers call hack silver, snipped and weighed and snipped again, so that a northern purse looks less like a wallet than like the sweepings of a jeweller's floor. And honestly, there is something restful in the idea, value with no face on it at all, just weight. True on any scale in any port from Dublin to the Volga. We even have a visitor's review of Hedeby, and it is one of my favourite documents of the entire age, because travel writing, it turns out, has not changed in 1,000 years. A merchant from Moorish Spain, Al-Tartushi by name, urbane, cultured, accustomed to the perfumed cities of the south, passed through in the 900s and set down his impressions, and they are, in the way of sophisticated tourists everywhere, magnificently unimpressed. The town, he sniffs, is poor in goods and riches. The people eat mainly fish, because there is so much of it. They throw newborn children into the sea to spare the cost of raising them, which we may charitably file under things a guide told a credulous tourist. The women, he notes with a rise of the eyebrows we can hear across 10 centuries, may divorce whenever they please. And the singing, God preserve us, the singing, never, he writes, have I heard uglier songs, a growling that comes from their throats like the barking of dogs, only worse. There he stands, our one eyewitness on the quay at Hedeby, hands over his ears, while around him roars the ordinary happy din of a northern market night, and every historian of the age would trade a shelf of chronicles for 1 hour of what he heard. And Hedeby was only the busiest bead on a whole necklace of such towns, Birka on its island in a Swedish lake, where the eastern furs met the western cloth, and Ansgar preached to polite, unhurried shrugs, Kopang down in a Norwegian bay whose very name just means market, Ribe on the North Seaside, and, further out, the half-northern ports we have already visited, York and Dublin and Novgorod. And along that necklace moved not only goods, but every fashion and idea and rumour of the age, and one traveller more, whom I cannot leave out, because he left us the closest thing we will ever have to a film of these people. In the year 921, the Caliph of Baghdad sent an embassy north to the Volga, and its secretary, a precise, pious, endlessly curious man named Ibn Fadlan, kept notes, and on the riverbank he met a trading company of the Rus, the Eastern Norsemen we shall follow properly in a moment, and he looked at them the way you would look at a rainbow made of axes. Never, he wrote, had he seen bodies more perfect. Tall as date palms, blonde and ruddy, every man tattooed from fingernails to neck with dark blue figures of trees and beasts, and never, he added in the same breath, had he seen anything filthier, sharing as they did one wash basin in the mornings, in a manner his tidy soul could not forgive. They are the dirtiest of God's creatures, he complains, and you can feel the two civilizations inspecting each other across 3 meters of riverbank, each quite sure the other is hopeless. But it is what he saw at the end that the world remembers, for while he was there a chieftain of the Rus died, and Ibn Fadlan watched and wrote down hour by hour the whole vast ceremony of a ship funeral, the dead lord dressed in brocade and set up on cushions aboard his vessel with weapons and meat and drink around him, the animals given to accompany him. The terrible fate of the slave girl who had chosen, if chosen is the word for anything done inside such a machine of custom, to follow her master, the old woman who presided over it all, whom they called the Angel of Death, and at last the nearest kinsman walking backward to the ship, naked, one hand covering his face against something, and firing the timber, and the whole thing ship-lord. Goods and all roaring up into flame while the company stood along the shore, and one of the Rus turned to the interpreter, Ibn Fadlan tells us, and took the trouble to explain, with a certain pity, you Arabs are fools. You put the men you love most into the ground where the worms take them. We burn ours in a moment, so that he enters paradise at once. And then the man laughed, and within an hour, Ibn Fadlan says, ship and girl and lord were ash on the wind, and they heaped a mound over the ashes and raised a birch post on it with the dead man's name cut in runes, and went back the next morning to trading furs. There they are, the whole people, in one afternoon on one riverbank, vanity and squalor, tenderness and horror, theatre and arithmetic, and a name cut on a post above the ashes, because always, the name, and it is with Ibn Fadlan's ink still wet, that we should turn at last and follow those same rivers all the way down to see what the rowing men built at the far ends of them. And now, while the western ships are still working their way from island to island across the top of the Atlantic, our story has to turn completely around, because the whole time, on the far side of Scandinavia, a second Viking age had been unfolding, every bit as large as the western one and far less famous. And it ran not over open ocean, but down rivers, into the endless forests of the east, and it was conducted, mostly not with the axe but with the scales, the little folding bronze scales for weighing silver that hung at every eastern trader's belt. And if the western story smells of salt and smoke, the eastern one smells of pine resin, riverbank mud, and money. The men who went east were mostly Swedes, whose home coast faces that way across the Baltic, and the peoples they met called them the Rus, a name probably grown from an old word for rowing men, and I will ask you to keep that little name in mind, lying there in the dark, because it is going to grow into the largest country on earth. Cross the Baltic with them, then, into the mouths of the eastern rivers, and feel how different this world is. No coasts to raid here, no rich abbeys with unlatched doors, only forest without end, running darkly away to the north and east, peopled thinly by Slavic and Finnish farmers and hunters, and threaded, this is the key to everything, by a lattice of great slow rivers that almost touch one another, so that a light northern ship, and you remember, from early in the night, that a longship can be carried, could work its way up one river, be hauled on rollers over a low watershed by its own crew, slide down the next river, and so on, stage by stage, portage by portage, clear across the width of a continent, until the forest finally opened and the water carried you out onto one of two seas, the Caspian, gateway to the silver cities of the Islamic East, or the Black Sea, beyond which lay the one city the entire north spoke of with awe, the city they called simply Miklagard, the great city, Constantinople, capital of the Roman Empire's surviving eastern half, a city of perhaps 500,000 people, at a time when the biggest town in Scandinavia held maybe 2,000. What drew the northerners down those rivers was, at bottom, one metal. In the 800s and 900s, the mines of the Islamic Caliphate were pouring out silver coins, dirhams, thin, beautiful, reliable, stamped with flowing Arabic script, and the north was hungry for silver the way its Lord's gift-giving wheel demanded. And the east, in turn, would pay silver for exactly what the northern forests held. Furs, sable and marten and fox and beaver honey, wax for the candles of two faiths, walrus ivory, amber, swords, and, we cannot look away from it, slaves, captives from the endless low wars of the forest peoples, marched and shipped south in numbers that are painful to think about, the traffic that more than any other filled the northern silver chests. And the silver came north in astonishing quantities, buried in the soil of the Baltic island of Gotland alone, which sat in the middle of this trade like a toll booth. Hoard after hoard has come out of the ground. Tens of thousands of Arabic coins minted in Samarkand and Baghdad and Tashkent, dug up by Swedish farmers 1,000 years later, the small change of a trade route that connected, think of it, the cod fisheries of Norway to the bazaars of Central Asia. Along the river roads the Rus planted their stations, a fort here, a market there, at first just wintering posts for the convoys, then permanent towns with halls and workshops and mixed populations of Norse traders, Slavic farmers, Finnish trappers, all intermarrying within a generation or two. The northern habit we have watched in Ireland and the Danelaw working just the same among the birches, at Staraya Ladoga near the Baltic entrance, at Novgorod, the new fort, master of the northern woods, and above all far to the south where the river Dnieper gathers itself for the run to the Black Sea, on a bluff above the water at Kiev. The old Rus chronicle tells the founding of all this as a fable, how the quarrelling tribes of the forest, unable to keep peace among themselves, sent across the sea to the Rus with the magnificent improbable invitation, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us." And 3 brothers came, and the eldest, Rurik, took Novgorod. And from him descended the princes of the land. Historians treat that invitation the way they treat the pit of snakes, but Rurik himself is real enough to have founded something enormous. Because the dynasty that traced itself to him, the House of Rurik, ruled first at Novgorod and then at Kiev, over a growing federation of river towns and tribute lands that took its name from its founders. The land of the Rus, Russia, and kept ruling it, prince after prince, Tsar after Tsar, for 700 years until 1598, which means the royal house of Russia outlasted the Viking Age itself by half a millennium, a rather large outcome for some rowing men with scales on their belts. The princes of Kiev grew rich taxing the river road, and each winter they went around the tribes collecting tribute in furs, and each spring the great convoy formed up at Kiev and ran the gauntlet south. And we know exactly how it went, because a Byzantine emperor wrote it down as intelligence, how the ships had to be portaged past the 7 cataracts of the lower Dnieper, the crews wading and hauling while armed men stood guard against the horsemen of the steppe, who shadowed the banks waiting for exactly that moment. And the rapids had names in both Norse and Slavic, the Gulper, the Ever Fierce, and past the last of them the convoy would stop on an island to make offerings of thanks under a sacred oak, bread and meat and lots drawn over cockerels, northern piety 1,000 miles from home, and then out at last onto the open Black Sea, and south, until there rose over the horizon the domes and the sea walls of the great city itself. Constantinople dazzled them, it dazzled everyone, and the Rus wanted what it had, and being who they were, they tried twice to simply take it, huge fleets out of the north falling on the imperial capital. In the year 860 and again later, and both times the city's walls, its navy and its terrifying secret weapon, the liquid fire that burned on water, settled the question decisively, and the Rus, being also who they were, drew the sensible conclusion, if you cannot sack the shop, open an account, and the emperors, who recognized useful barbarians when repelling them, drew the matching one. And the result was a string of trade treaties whose actual texts survive, copied into the Rus Chronicle, setting out in wonderfully municipal detail how many Rus merchants might enter the city at a time, no more than 50, unarmed, by one particular gate, where they would lodge, their free monthly allowance of bread, wine, meat and fish, and their right. This detail always makes me smile as I fall asleep. To free access to the public baths, the wild men of the river road negotiated down the centuries into gentlemen with towels. And there was one clause more. The emperors, sizing up these enormous axe-carrying northerners, began to hire them, and out of that hiring grew the most famous bodyguard in the medieval world, the Varangian Guard, the emperor's own regiment of Northmen, paid in gold, trusted precisely because they were foreign, having no stake whatever in the empire's incessant palace conspiracies. And for 2 centuries a career in the Guard was the great adventure open to any ambitious young man in Scandinavia. Serve the emperor, walk the marble city, come home scarred and rich. And across Sweden today stand runestones raised by proud families to sons who did exactly that, or never came home from it. He died in Greece, say the stones. He took his share of gold, and on a marble parapet high in the great cathedral of Constantinople itself, scratched 1,000 years ago by some bored northern guardsman during what one can only assume was a very long sermon. Archaeologists found a line of runic graffiti reading, more or less half done was here, which may be the single most human artifact the entire age has left us. Meanwhile, at Kiev, the river princes were becoming something their grandfathers would have blinked at, and the hinge of it is a story the chronicle tells with perfectly straight face, how Prince Vladimir of Kiev, great-great-grandson of the Sea Kings, decided around the year 988 that his growing realm needed a proper modern religion, and sent envoys out to shop among the faiths. And the envoys reported back, the chronicle says, that the Muslims did not drink, which Vladimir ruled out on the spot as unsuitable for the Rus, that the German churches were plain, but that in the great church of Constantinople we knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. For on earth there is no such splendour, and so the Rus took their Christianity from the Greeks. With all that would follow from that choice, down 1,000 years of Russian history, the domes, the icons, the alphabet, the Tsars who called themselves heirs of Byzantium, all of it flowing, in the chronicles telling, from one committee's travel report. And whatever the true politics behind the tale, the direction of it is exact. The rowing men had come down the rivers as raiders and peddlers, and their descendants in the 4th generation were building stone cathedrals on the bluff above the Dnieper and marrying the daughters of emperors. The East had swallowed the Vikings as it swallows everyone, and turned them into something new, and that, as we shall see when we come back west, is really the story of the whole of this final act, everywhere at once, the wolves settling down. One baptism, one marriage, one law code at a time, into the very world they had spent a century shaking, and nowhere on earth did that transformation work out more strangely, or matter more to history, than in the story we must tell next, which begins with a huge Norwegian outlaw standing at the mouth of the river Seine, looking up it toward Paris, and ends with his great-great-great-grandson wearing the crown of England. So settle deeper into the pillow, and let us go and meet the man they called Rollo the Walker, because he was too big, men said, for any horse to carry. By the closing years of the 800s, the kingdom of the West Franks had been living with the ships for 3 generations, and had tried everything, fighting, paying, bridge building, praying. A famous line crept into the litanies of the age, from the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us, and still the fleets came up the Seine as regularly as the salmon. One enormous fleet had even besieged Paris itself for a whole year, the city by now walled and bridged, and fighting back street by street from its island. And though Paris held, the wider lesson the Franks took from that terrible year was that the crown could not everywhere be strong enough, and slowly, in the practical Frankish way, a new idea began to form. One of those ideas that look like surrender and turn out to be judo. Among the warbands still working the scene in those years was one led by a chieftain named Rollo, a man about whom the sagas and the chronicles agree on very little except his effectiveness and his size. Norwegian by some accounts, Danish by others, called the Walker, the story goes, because no horse could carry him, and so he marched with his men. And by about the year 911 Rollo's people were no longer really a fleet at all. They were an armed population squatting in the green country around the lower Seine, wintering there, farming there in an improvised way, going nowhere. And the Frankish king Charles called the Simple, which in the language of the time meant not stupid but straightforward, looked at this permanent, unremovable fact sitting athwart his richest river, and made it an offer that has to be ranked among the boldest bargains in European history. Keep it. Keep the land you are sitting on, the lower Seine valley, the coast, the river mouth, hold it as my vassal, legally, with my blessing. And in exchange, 3 things: be baptized, be loyal, and, the heart of the deal, keep your cousins out. Because who, after all, is better qualified to stop Viking fleets coming up the Seine than a Viking sitting at the mouth of it with every incentive to guard his own new property? The treaty was struck at a little place called St. Clair-sur-Epte, and the chronicles could not resist decorating it with a scene. How at the homage ceremony Rollo was told he must kiss the king's foot in token of submission, and found the requirement beneath him, and delegated it to one of his warriors, who rather than kneel, seized the royal foot and hoisted it to his mouth standing, tipping the king of the Franks flat on his back in front of the entire court. And whether or not a word of that is true, and it is almost certainly not, the fact that the Normans themselves love to tell it tells you everything about the spirit of the arrangement. We will take your religion and your law and your king, and we will not be taking them lying down. What no one at St. Clair Surrepty could have known is that the bargain would work beyond anyone's dream, in both directions. Rollo kept his word, was baptized, parcelled the land among his captains, and, poacher-turned-gamekeeper, defended his river against all comers, and his people did the thing, one final time, that we have now watched them do in Ireland and England and the river towns of the East. They married in. And this time with a completeness that startles even by their standards. Within 3 generations, the Northmen of the Seine, the Normanni, the Normans, as the land itself became Normandy, had traded their language for French, their gods for saints' days, their open ships for war horses, because the flat green country of northern France is cavalry country, and the descendants of men who had never sat a horse in battle became, in about a century, the most feared heavy cavalry in Europe, and yet under the French speech and the Christian observance the old operating system ran on unchanged. The restlessness, the appetite for other people's kingdoms, the gift for arriving where they were not expected, the cold-eyed talent for absorbing whatever worked, and the Normans would carry that operating system out of Normandy in the century to come, and build with it, of all things, kingdoms in the Mediterranean sun, in southern Italy and Sicily, won by landless Norman younger sons, who went out as hired lances and stayed as kings. Which is the Viking Age's whole plot compressed into a single sentence, and of course, most famously of all, they would carry it back across the Channel. But that thread, the biggest of them all, we must leave lying on the table just a little longer, because it is not yet ready, and because back in Scandinavia itself, while Rollo's grandsons were learning French, something even more consequential was happening. The North was changing sides. Not in war, in religion. And it is worth taking this slowly, drowsily, because the conversion of Scandinavia is the true end of the Viking Age arriving in slow motion, 100-year sunset, and it did not happen the way the storybooks would have it, with missionaries martyred on beaches. It happened, mostly the northern way, by trade, by marriage, by treaty, and by kings doing arithmetic. It had been seeping in for generations. Merchants who dealt in Christian ports found it convenient to accept a preliminary blessing, the prime signing, a sort of associate membership that let you trade with the baptized without committing yourself, and plenty of practical northerners simply added the white Christ to the shelf alongside Thor, as one more useful power worth a nod. There are moulds surviving in which a smith cast crosses and hammer amulets side by side, presumably asking each customer which they were having, or whether perhaps both, cover being cover. Slaves and wives brought their faith into the longhouses at the hearth level where habits are really made, and a German monk named Ansgar had preached at the market town of Birka as early as the 800s, planting little congregations that flickered and mostly went out, patient seed on stony ground. But faiths in that world finally moved when kings moved, and the king who moved first and mattered most ruled in Denmark in the middle of the 900s, and his name was Harold, son of Gorm, called Bluetooth, for reasons lost, possibly a dead and darkened tooth. And I am obliged by the customs of our own age to pause here, very briefly, on the strangeness of his afterlife, because 1100 years later some engineers designing a short-range radio standard to link different devices into one network borrowed. Half as a joke, the name of the king who had linked the different Danish lands into one kingdom, and so it is that his initials, in runes, glow today on the screen of the very device most of you are using to listen to me. H and B, bound into one little symbol, and somewhere in the dark the old ring giver is presumably demanding royalties. Harold Bluetooth was baptized around the 960s. The tale says after a missionary priest carried glowing iron in his bare hands unburned to prove whose god was stronger. Though treaty pressure from the great German Empire to his south will have concentrated his mind at least as wonderfully, and whatever the mixture, Harold did nothing by halves. At the royal centre of Jelling, where his pagan father lay in a great mound, Harold raised a church, and beside it a massive 3-sided stone, carved on one face with runes, on another with a great beast entwined in a serpent, and on the third with the oldest image of Christ in Scandinavia, a Christ standing not on a cross, but bound in branching interlace, like a god caught in the world tree, the two imaginations meeting on one rock, and the runes say, King Harold ordered this monument made in memory of Gorm his father and Thyra his mother, that Harold who won for himself all Denmark and Norway, and made the Danes Christian. Historians note gently that all 3 claims are rounded upward, king's monuments being king's monuments, but the stone stands there still. In the churchyard at Jelling, and the Danes call it the nation's baptismal certificate, the whole turning of the age cut into one boulder. Norway's turning was harder and bloodier, done in 2 hard pushes by 2 hard kings. First the sea king Olaf Tryggvason, a returned Viking of the classic pattern, England raiding, Danegeld Rich, baptised abroad, who came home, took the crown, and offered his chieftains a memorably compressed theology, baptism or battle, and made it stick along the coasts for 5 furious years, before dying in a doomed and gorgeous sea fight, leaping from the deck of his great ship the Long Serpent in full mail, and a generation later another Olaf Haraldsson, stouter and steadier, finished the work with law codes as much as swords, and was killed for it in the end, at the Battle of Stickelstad in the year 1030, by an alliance of his own resentful chieftains, and then, in the strangest turn of all, the dead king won. Miracles were reported at his grave, the harvests turned kind, opinion swung the way opinion does, and within a year or 2 the chieftains who had killed him were carrying his shrine. And Olaf the king became Saint Olaf, Norway's eternal king, his axe on the national coat of arms to this day, and pilgrims walked to his tomb at Nidaros for 500 years, and among the men who stood in the shield wall against him at Stickelstad, on the losing-winning side of that battle, was the saint's own half-brother, a furious, ambitious boy of 15 who took a bad wound, hid in a farmhouse, and swore as he healed that he would come back for the crown, and his name was Harold Sigurdsson, and the world would come to call him Hardrada, the hard ruler, and he, at last, is the man who will close our story, so keep him there, healing in the farmhouse, sword across his knees, while we go and see what has been happening in England, where all the oldest threads of this night are beginning to draw together into one knot. England, when we left it, was whole and watchful, Alfred's grandchildren ruling a united country that had digested its Danelaw and prospered on it, and for 2 full generations the watching was enough, the fleets stayed away, the burghs kept their markets, and England grew rich, conspicuously, complacently rich, with the best run coinage in Western Europe, mints in every town, taxes that actually arrived, wool going out and silver coming in, and it is one of history's more reliable rules that nothing in the world is as dangerous as being rich, well organised, and badly led, because the organisation means the wealth can be efficiently collected, and the leadership means it will be. In the year 978 the crown of this rich, well-run England came, by way of his half-brother's murder at Corfe, a murder his own household was widely believed to have arranged, to a boy of about 12 named Ethelred, and he would reign for 38 years, and it is fair to say no king of England has ever needed a good nickname more, or received a worse one. His people came to call him Ethelred Unrayed, and the joke, because it is a joke. A bitter one. Works like this. His name Ethelred means noble counsel, and Unrayed means no counsel, ill counsel, so the whole label reads something like good advice the ill-advised, which the centuries, missing the pun, wore down into Ethelred the Unready, and Unready, in the end, is what everything he touched turned out to be. Because the fleets came back, the North had heard the silver singing again, and the new generation of raiders was not the old free for all of chieftains trying their luck. These were royal expeditions, disciplined professional forces led by kings and future kings of a now consolidated Scandinavia. Men like the Norwegian Olaf Tryggvason, whom we have already met mid-conversion, and behind them the King of Denmark himself, Svein Forkbeard, son of old Harald Bluetooth, a son sufficiently in the family tradition to have taken the throne by rebelling against his own father, and against such men England's response was set in the very first serious test, in the year 991 at Maldon in Essex, where a raiding fleet camped on a tidal island in the estuary linked to the shore. You will notice the echo of the beginning of our night by a narrow causeway that the sea covered and uncovered, and the old English ealdorman Beartnoth drew up his shire levies on the landward side, and the tide was with the English, because the raiders could only come at them 3 abreast across the causeway, where 3 brave men could and did hold them all day, and so the raiders stuck. Tried words, and called across the water, with magnificent cheek, that this was no fair fight, and would the Englishmen not let them cross and settle it properly, and Beartnoth, in the phrase of the great poem written about that day, for his overmod, his overheart, his pride, gave them the ground, ordered his men back, let the whole army across the causeway, and was cut down with the best of his men by evening, the poem giving to one of his old retainers, standing over the body refusing to leave, the most famous lines of defiance in Old English: thought shall be the harder, heart the keener, courage the greater, as our strength lessons, and those lines, note them drowsily, are a kind of tombstone for the whole heroic idea. Because after Maldon, England's actual policy became the exact opposite of them. England paid £10,000 of silver after Maldon, on the advice of the King's Council, and you already know, from the Frankish chapters of this night, precisely how that programme runs, because it ran in England exactly as it had run on the Seine, each payment larger, each interval shorter, £16,000. 24,000, 36,000, 48,000. The sums doubling like a folktale wish gone wrong. Millions of coins struck to order from the well-run mints, carted to the coast and rowed away north. So much English silver that Scandinavian museums today hold more coins of Aethelred than English ones do, and somewhere in Sweden a man raised a runestone to a son who, it boasts, took 3 gelds in England, a career, 3 rounds of showing up and being paid to stop. And the payments bought, each time a season or 2 of quiet, and taught, each time the only lesson money spent that way ever teaches: come back soon. And then Aethelred, in the year 1002, did the one thing that could make it all worse. And it is the darkest page in his story. Convinced or persuaded that the Danes living peaceably inside England, traders, mercenaries, families 2 generations settled, were a 5th column plotting his death, he sent out secret orders that on St. Brice's Day, the 13th of November, all Danish men in his kingdom were to be killed, and in the towns where the order could be carried out, it was with horrors the excavations still turn up, and among the dead, the tradition says, was a woman named Gunhild, sister of Svein Forkbeard, King of Denmark. Whether the massacre truly reached her, whether vengeance for a sister, or plain appetite for a rich, self-wounding kingdom moved him more, no one can now weigh, but the outcome sits in the chronicle plain as weather. From 1003 onwards Svein Forkbeard came at England not as a raider, but as a nemesis, campaign after campaign, year after year, grinding the country down. And the payments went on, and the councils quarrelled, and the great English lords began, one by one, to make their private arrangements, treachery spreading through the kingdom's joints like damp, the chronicle for these years reading like a long low moan. And at last, in the summer of 1013, Svein came no longer for silver at all. He sailed up the Trent to Gainsborough, and simply called for the country's surrender, and the exhausted north gave in at once. The Danelaw shires first, old kinships counting, then town after town southward, until London itself, which had fought hardest and longest, gave in too when Aethelred slipped out of it, and by Christmas of 1013 the King of England was a refugee in Normandy, staying with his in-laws, for he had married, years before, Emma, the Duke of Normandy's sister. A marriage that had been meant to close the Channel ports to Viking fleets and would instead, in the fullness of time, hand her great-nephew William a claim to the English crown, and Svein Forkbeard, great-grandson of pagan Gorm, sat king of all England. The whole project of the age achieved, the richest prize in the West simply taken, entire, he enjoyed it for 5 weeks. In February 1014 Svein died suddenly at Gainsborough, and the whole enormous question fell open again, and out of the confusion that followed came the 2 young men who would fight the true last round. On the English side, Ethelred's son Edmund, called Ironside for how he fought, everything his father was not. And on the Danish side, Svein's younger son, a calm, watchful, coldly intelligent prince in his early 20s named Cnut, and through the terrible year 1016 these two hammered each other up and down England, 5 pitched battles in a single campaigning season, while London stood siege behind its walls, until the last great fight at a Sandown in Essex went to Cnut when, at the turning hour, one more English lord changed sides one more time. And the 2 exhausted kings did then what the exhausted country ached for. They met on an island in the Severn and split the land between them. Edmund to hold Wessex, Cnut the rest. The survivor to take all. And within weeks, Edmund Ironside, worn through at perhaps 26, was dead. And in the year 1017 Cnut, son of Svein, was crowned king of all England in London, and the long duel of England and the Northmen, begun on the sands of Lindisfarne 224 years before, ended not with a burning, but with a coronation, a Danish king anointed by English bishops in an English church, swearing to keep the laws of King Edgar. And what kind of king he made, and how strange and calm and almost dreamlike the ending of that story is, deserves the next quiet stretch of our night to itself. Cnut is the great surprise of the whole story, and the shape of the surprise is this. The son of the conqueror, the great-grandson of pagan kings, heir to 2 centuries of the fury of the Northmen, turned out to be one of the best kings England ever had, and knew exactly what he was doing every step of the way. He began, it is true, in the family manor. There were executions in the first year, chief among them the most gifted traitor of the late wars, on the sensible northern principle that a man who has sold 2 kings will sell a third, and there was one political marriage of pure genius, for Cnut married Emma of Normandy, Ethelred's widow, the old king's queen becoming the new king's queen, which at a stroke soothed the English, neutralised Normandy, and folded the old regime into the new one. And Emma, let it be said, was nobody's pawn, a formidable political operator who would stand at the centre of English power for 40 years under 2 crowns. And then, the housekeeping done, Cnut did the thing none of his predecessors in the long line of sea kings had ever done. He stopped. He paid off the great fleet with one final enormous geld and sent it home, keeping only a small standing guard. He wrote open letters to his English people, which survive, promising to be a gracious lord, to uphold the old laws, to rule Dane and Englishman with one justice, and he kept English earls in office, kept English bishops at his elbow, gave to the church with both hands, rebuilt at his own cost the abbeys his ancestors had burned, and made a point of honouring, of all people, St. Edmund, the East Anglian king, shot full of arrows by the sons of Ragnar, and endowing the shrine of Alfred's Line at Winchester, the conqueror carefully stitching himself into the quilt of English memory, and England, which had known nothing for a generation but burning coasts and doubled taxes, discovered that it had accidentally acquired something it had not had in living memory. Peace. Real peace. Because the sea, for the first time in 200 years, was friendly. The raiders could not come. Since the king of the raiders was the king of England, and the fleets of Denmark were his fleets, and when his brother died, Snut took Denmark too, and then Norway, and for a dozen years there existed a thing historians call the North Sea Empire, England. Denmark, Norway and a slice of Sweden under one crown. The whole Viking world and its favourite victim gathered into a single realm whose highways were the sea roads, with London and Winchester among its capitals. And Cnut ruled this waterborne empire as the most respected northern king in Europe, and in the year 1027 he did the thing that shows better than any battle how completely the world had turned. He went to Rome, the descendant of the men who sacked the monasteries, walking as an honoured royal pilgrim to the tomb of St. Peter, attending the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor, negotiating toll reductions for English and Danish pilgrims on the Alpine roads, writing home another open letter. I have vowed to God to live a right life in all things, and to us, at the far end of the story, it reads like the age itself, formally signing the peace. And it is to this king, of course, that the most famous story of all attaches, the story everyone knows and nearly everyone knows wrong. How King Cnut had his chair carried down to the tide line and commanded the incoming sea to halt, and the sea, naturally, came on and wet his royal feet, and the point in the oldest telling is not that Cnut was a fool who believed he could command the tide. It is the opposite. He did it to shut up his own flatterers, courtiers who had been assuring the master of 4 kingdoms that even the sea would obey him, and when the water had soaked his shoes he turned to them and said, "Let all the world know that the power of kings is empty and worthless, and there is no king worthy of the name save him whose command heaven, earth and sea obey," and hung his golden crown, the chronicler adds, on a crucifix and never wore it again. And whether or not it happened, and it is almost certainly a preacher's parable, the fact that this, of all tales, is the one the world chose to remember about the last great Viking emperor, the Sea King teaching a lesson in the limits of power with the incoming tide as his blackboard, is its own kind of perfect, and it makes, I have always thought, one of the most soothing images in all of history to fall asleep on. The old king in his chair on the wet sand, the flatterers shuffling, the grey water coming quietly on, wave after wave taking no notice of anyone, the way it came in over the sands of Lindisfarne at the beginning of our night, the way it is coming in on some dark beach right now while you lie warm and still. But empires built on one man last one man's lifetime. Cnut died in 1035, barely 40, and his empire died with him, his sons proving, in 7 short years, textbook illustrations of the rule that great fathers are hard acts. And when the dust settled, the crown of England came round, by the strange patience of blood, to the last surviving son of Aethelred and Emma, Edward, called the Confessor, so pious and so childless that his dying in the first days of 1066 left the throne of the richest kingdom in the West effectively vacant, with 3 men reaching for it. And now, at last, every thread we have laid down through this whole long night gets picked up and tied, so pull the blanket a little closer, because the year 1066 is where the Viking Age goes to end, and it ends, fittingly, with a giant. Harold Sigurdsson Hardrada, the Hard Ruler, King of Norway, the boy we left healing in a farmhouse after Stiklestad 36 years ago, had lived in the meantime one of the most preposterous lives in the historical record, and I mean that as a compliment. 15 years old at Stiklestad on his half-brother the Saint's losing side, he fled east over the mountains to the courts of the Rus, served the Grand Prince of Kiev as a captain, wooed the prince's daughter Elisabeth, and was told in effect, "Come back when you are rich," and so he went where a big, ambitious northerner went to get rich, down the river road to Miklagard, and joined the Varangian Guard, and spent 10 years as the Emperor's axe, fighting in Sicily and Italy and the Holy Land, in palace coups and island revolts, amassing, the sagas say, treasure beyond any private man in the north, shipped in chests to Kiev for safekeeping, and the tales that gathered around him in those years, escaping a Byzantine prison. Blinding an emperor, feigning his own death to be carried in a coffin through the gates of a besieged town, and then popping out, may be polished past truth, but they were the sort of tales men only bothered to invent about the sort of man he verifiably was. Rich at last, he came back up the rivers, married his Elizabeth, and took the crown of Norway, and ruled it for 20 years in exactly the style his nickname advertises. And when the English throne fell empty in 1066, Harold Hardrada, now 50 years old, the most famous warrior in the northern world, dug out of the attic of dynastic memory an old claim running back to a pact of Knut's son, and decided on one last, enormous, old-fashioned throw, the full ancestral programme, a fleet, an army, a kingdom to be taken over the side of a ship, and in September he came down on the coast of Yorkshire with 300 sails, the biggest northern fleet England had seen in 50 years. Burned Scarborough on the way in the grand old manor, smashed the northern earls in battle outside York, took the city's submission, and stood for about 4 days on the very lip of achieving it all again, 1066 looking, for those 4 days, like 866 come round on the wheel, and it is exactly here, at the top of the last wave, that the whole 300-year story turns its final corner, and we should slow down and take it almost hour by hour, because history was about to produce one of its most brutal pieces of timing, and the age of the ships was about to end in a single autumn fortnight, at a place with the quiet, ordinary name of Stamford Bridge. The King of England in that September was Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king, a capable, energetic, deeply English magnate who had taken the crown on the Confessor's death in January and had spent his entire first summer as king standing on the south coast with his army, staring at the Channel, because the second claimant, Duke William of Normandy, great-great-great-grandson of Rollo the Walker, whose family name for him we should note in passing and then pass on, was William the Bastard, had built an invasion fleet and was waiting on the far shore for a fair wind. And the wind all summer refused to come fair, and in early September, with provisions gone and harvest calling, Harold had at last stood his southern levies down, and it was precisely then, into that one unguarded fortnight, that the news came galloping south, Hardrada in Yorkshire, York fallen, the north on its knees. What Harold Godwinson did next was, by any military standard of the age, barely possible. He gathered his household troops, called the shires back out, and marched the length of England, London to Yorkshire, 16 days after standing down, covering the distance in well under a week, moving so fast that no rumour outran him, and on the morning of the 25th of September, Hardrada's army, camped at ease at Stamford Bridge on the Derwent a few miles from York, waiting to collect hostages, in warm autumn sunshine so unexpected that the sagas make a point of it. The men had left their mail shirts at the ships, looked up from the riverbank, and saw a dust cloud on the road from York resolve into the glittering shield line of the entire English royal army, and one of the sagas gives the moment a line of pure cinema, the sunlight flashing on the weapons, the saga says, like a field of broken ice. There was a parley, the tale goes, a rider coming out of the English line to offer Harold's English ally, the king's own estranged brother, his earldom back if he would stand aside, and when the ally asked what the King of Norway would be given, the rider, who was, the saga insists, King Harold himself unrecognised, answered with the most famous sentence of the whole northern age: 7 feet of English ground, or as much more as he is taller than other men, and the fight that followed was long and terrible, and in the end total, the unarmoured Norwegians holding the bridge, one enormous berserk axeman, the story says, holding the crossing alone against the whole English army until a spearman drifted under the bridge in a swill tub and thrust up between the planks. And beyond the bridge the shield ring forming around the Raven banner, and Harold Hardrada, 50 years old, fighting in the front of it in his shirt sleeves, took an arrow through the throat and fell, and got in due course exactly the 7 feet promised, and of the 300 ships that had brought the army south, 24, the chronicle says, 24, were enough to carry the survivors home, and the boy who sailed home in one of them as the new King of Norway, Hardrada's son, made peace with England and kept it, and no Scandinavian royal fleet ever came for England again. The Viking Age, as the long books measure it, died at Stamford Bridge with the last and greatest of the sea kings, 273 years, almost to the season, after the ships came out of the morning at Lindisfarne. And history, having closed that book, allowed itself a final chapter of the blackest, most perfect irony instead, because on the 27th of September, 2 days after Stamford Bridge, While the English army stood victorious and bleeding and 400 kilometres from home, the wind in the Channel at last went fair, and William of Normandy came ashore in Sussex unopposed, and Harold Godwinson turned his exhausted men around and force-marched them the whole length of England a second time, and on the 14th of October, on a hillside near Hastings, at the end of the worst month any army ever had, the last English king went down before the Norman cavalry. An arrow, the tradition says, in his eye, and England was conquered after all, in the same autumn in which it had saved itself, and here is the sentence to carry with you towards sleep. It was conquered not by the Vikings, who had just failed forever, but by the Vikings' great-grandchildren, the men of Normandy. Rollo's people, French-speaking, Christian, mounted, castle-building, and northern to the marrow underneath it all, so that the Viking Age of England ended twice in one October, once at a bridge in Yorkshire where the old model died sword in hand, and once on a hill in Sussex where the new model, the absorbed, adapted, upgraded model, took the whole kingdom and kept it. And every English monarch from that day to this one descends, through William, from a Viking chieftain who once stood at the mouth of the Seine and decided, on the whole, to stay. So why did it end the whole great age? Why did the ships stop coming? And the honest, gentle answer, the one to drift on, is that nothing defeated the Vikings. Nothing ever really defeated the Vikings. Rather, the world they had operated in closed up around them, and they themselves closed it. The unguarded coasts grew walls and watchmen, the burhs and the fortified bridges and, after Normandy's example, the castles, until the old arithmetic of surprise no longer paid. The quarrelling little kingdoms that had been such soft targets consolidated, partly in response to the ships themselves, into real states with real navies, England first among them, so that the age's favourite prey evolved, under predation, into something with shells and spines, and Scandinavia consolidated the same way and at the same time into Denmark, Norway and Sweden. 3 Christian crowns whose kings had tax rolls and bishops and no interest whatever in licensing freelance violence they could not control, a king's peace being, above all, a monopoly. The conversion mattered just as deeply, not because the new faith made the Northerners meek, the Normans stand as eternal proof it did not, but because it moved them inside the walls of the same moral and political house as their neighbours, and raids on fellow Christians came trailing excommunications and treaty consequences, and the young men who would once have gone Viking for silver and a name could now get both, with the Church's blessing as crusaders or as some king's housecarls, the same energy, relabelled and leashed. And the silver itself moved, the eastern mines that had powered the river road faltered, the Dirham stream thinned, the great gift-giving wheel found new, duller, steadier fuels. Tolls and taxes and tithes. Piracy in the northern seas never vanished. It merely stopped being a career a king's son would boast of, and somewhere in the 1100s it becomes simply crime, which is, if you like, the least romantic possible definition of the end of an age, the moment the saga material turns into a police matter. The last true fling of the old style came as late as 1151, when Earl Rognvald of Orkney, a poet, crusader and thoroughly medieval gentleman, led a fleet to the Mediterranean, harrying and versifying his way to the Holy Land in what historians have called, affectionately, the last Viking expedition, and even that was half a pilgrimage, the wolf gone grey and gone respectable. And after him the sea roads belonged to the merchants of the new German towns, and the dragon ships rotted in the boat sheds, and the age was over everywhere except in the one place ages never end, which is memory, and it is into memory, the strange, rich, firelit afterlife of the Vikings, that we should follow them now, for the last stretch of our night together, as the fire burns down to its softest red. Because here is the quiet miracle at the end of all the noise, almost everything we have shared tonight, the gods and the ring-givers, the burning of Lindisfarne, Ragnar and the snakes, the 7 feet of English ground, we have it because of the one Viking colony that never fought anybody, the farmers of Iceland, who, having settled an island with no forests to speak of, no marble, no gold and weather that regularly tried to remove the roofs from their houses, decided apparently collectively that the thing they would be best in the world at was remembering. It began in the winters, which in Iceland are very long, and in the halls, where the whole household lay along the benches in the fire lit dark, with nothing to do between milking times, and the old entertainment of the whole North, the recited poem, the told tale, the genealogy that wound like a river through 4 generations to explain why 2 living neighbours hated each other, was polished there, winter after winter, into a national art. Every farm had its reciter. Children learned verses the way they learnt to walk. Icelanders abroad became famous as court poets. The age's press corps, a king who wanted his battles remembered, hired an Icelander the way you would hire a photographer. And the poems they composed, dense, glittering, riddling things where a ship is the horse of the wave and gold is the fire of the river, were built so tightly that they could pass down 2 centuries of mouths without losing their shape, carrying inside them, like flies in amber, the names and dates and deeds of the whole age. And then, in the 11 and 1200s, long after the last dragon ship was firewood, the grandchildren of the settlers did the decisive thing. They wrote it all down, on calfskin, in their own language, not in Latin, which makes them almost unique in medieval Europe, hundreds upon hundreds of manuscripts, and what they wrote falls into piles, each of which would alone justify a civilization. One pile holds the mythology, the stories of the gods, Odin's eye and Thor's hammer and the world tree and the twilight of the gods, gathered in the books we call the Eddas, one of them assembled by the most remarkable of all the rememberers, a fat, brilliant, scheming 13th century chieftain named Snorri Sturluson, law speaker of the Althing, politician, historian, poet, who wrote out the old pagan myths 200 years after his country had converted, carefully, affectionately, so that young poets would still understand the old kennings. And but for Snorri and his colleagues, nearly everything anyone has ever known, painted, composed, or filmed about the northern gods, would simply not exist. No Valhalla, no Ragnarok, no Thursday matinee superhero with the hammer. The entire northern imagination of the modern world rests on a few dozen Icelandic calfskins. Another pile holds the king's sagas, Snorri again at the centre with his great chronicle of the kings of Norway, from legend down through Fairhair and both Olaf's to Hardrada and beyond, the spine of everything we said tonight about the northern crowns. And the third pile, the strangest and to many of us the most precious, holds the family sagas, the sagas of the Icelanders themselves, which are, and there is no way to say this that does not sound anachronistic, realistic novels, written 700 years before the realistic novel was supposed to be invented. Terse, cool, unsentimental stories not of kings but of farmers. Their feuds and marriages and law cases, women with iron wills, men who say one dry sentence and then act on it forever, love that goes wrong at haymaking, a burned house, a verdict at the Althing, and the prose is so plain and modern that you can hand a translation to someone tonight and they will simply read it, no scholarly apparatus required. And scholars have argued for 2 centuries about how much in them is history and how much is art, and the drowsy truth is that they are both at once. Memory that has been loved into shape, and when archaeologists followed the sailing directions of one of those sagas to a bay in Newfoundland and found the turf walls exactly where the story said to look, the whole world got a lesson in how long, and how well a fireside can remember. And while Iceland was remembering in ink, the earth itself, it turned out, had been remembering in its own way, and the last 150 years have been the age of the second telling, the telling of the spades. In 1880, at a farm called Gokstad on the Oslo fjord, diggers opened a great burial mound and found a whole longship in the blue clay. 76 feet of her, oak, clinker-built, buried around the year 900 with a chieftain laid amidships, and the clay had sealed her so well that she stands today in a bright hall in Oslo, complete, and modern replicas built plank for plank to her lines have crossed the Atlantic under sail, one of them in 1893, in 28 days, rather pointedly upstaging that year's celebrations of Columbus. and in 1904, nearby at Oseberg, a second mound gave up something even more haunting. A slimmer, more beautiful ship, her prow carved in spirals as fine as manuscript borders, and aboard her not a warrior at all, but two women, an old one and a younger one, queen and companion, priestess and servant, no one knows. Laid out with wagons and sledges and tapestries and chests, the richest northern burial ever opened, and not a written word in it anywhere, only things, and the things say what the whole age says, that these people sent their greatest dead into the dark the only way that made sense to them, aboard a ship, going somewhere. Since then the ground has never really stopped talking. 5 workaday ships scuttled as harbour blockades raised from a Danish fjord at Skuldelev, giving us the freighters and ferries of the age alongside its wolves, a whole army's silver camp at Repton over the bones of the great heathen winter, the mass graves at Oxford that may hold St. Brice's Day itself, Arabic coins under Swedish barley fields, a bronze Buddha of all quiet travellers from the far end of the river road, resting in a Swedish grave like a stamp in a passport. And, in 2017, a fresh look at an old grave from Birka, the famous warrior burial, weapons, 2 horses, a game board set for tactics, excavated in the 1870s and confidently labelled a great male. Captain for a century and a half, until Dina said, in the flat voice Dina uses, female, and the arguments that followed were long and loud and are not finished. And somewhere, one likes to think, the grandmother by the fire from the beginning of our night is smiling into her wool. Because she could have told them. The stories always had women with swords in them. And the earth, patient under the barley all this time, does not forget a thing. And since we are gathering up the threads the age left trailing, there is one thread we owe a proper ending. Because we left Ireland, you may remember, far back in the early dark of this night, with the Longforts hardening into towns and Dublin filling with masts, and Ireland's farewell to the Viking Age is a story all its own, and the way it was remembered is stranger and more beautiful than the way it happened, which makes it the perfect tale for this hour, when we are half in history and half in dream. What happened over the long run of the 900s is the pattern you will recognise by now with your eyes closed, the settling, the marrying in, the slow braiding of 2 peoples. Until the Norse of Dublin and Waterford and Limerick was something the annals call the foreigner Gaels, Norse-Irish, bilingual, intermarried to every dynasty in the island, Christian in the main, minting Ireland's first coins, still the best sailors and the biggest merchants in the Western Sea, and enrolled enthusiastically in the immemorial national sport of Irish dynastic politics, fighting sometimes against the Irish kings, and quite as often for them, one hired fleet against another. And out of that seething chessboard rose, at the century's end, a genuinely remarkable man, Brian Boru, born a younger son of a middling clan in the southwest, who by patience, war and matchless political craft made himself over 40 years the first effective High King of all Ireland in centuries, overlord of Irish and Norse-Irish alike, taker of Dublin's tribute. And an old man of legend-brushing age, and in the year 1014 the board turned against him one last time. Dublin's Norse king and the province of Leinster in revolt together, with hired axes summoned from Orkney and Man and the whole Viking Sea, and on Good Friday of that year the 2 great hosts met on the shore north of Dublin, at a fishing weir by a place called Clontarf, and fought from morning tide to evening tide, one of the largest and most terrible battles the island had ever seen, and by dusk the revolt was broken, the foreign fleet was drowning in the returning tide it had beached itself against. And the old High King was dead, killed, the tradition says, in his tent at his prayers by axemen fleeing the wreck, victory and the victor taken in the same hour. In the sober light of the record books, Clontarf was an Irish civil war with Norse regiments on both sides, and the towns opened their gates afterward and went on trading, for the merchants of Dublin were far too useful to expel, and their blood and their ships and their street names are in the city yet. But that is not how the ages chose to remember it, And here is where the tale turns to silk. Because within a generation the storytellers of two nations had taken Clontarf between them and woven it up into something vast. The Irish making it the day Holy Ireland broke the heathen forever, old Brian ascending as Saint King and father of a dynasty of tale-tellers, and the Norse. This is the part I love, making of their own defeated doom poem that stands with anything the North ever imagined. For the great Icelandic saga of Burnt Njal tells how on that Good Friday morning a man in Caithness, at the top of Scotland, at the far end of the Viking Sea, saw 12 riders vanish into a woman's bower, and looked inside, and there were the Valkyries at a loom, weaving. And the loom was strung with the guts of men, weighted with severed heads, the shuttles were arrows, and the beater was a sword. And as they wove, they sang the battle then being fought at Dublin, choosing the slain thread by thread, blood raining from the web. And when the cloth was done, they tore it apart, each keeping her shred, and mounted, 6 riding north and 6 riding south, to carry the news, and men, the saga adds with its usual terrifying calm, saw and heard such marvels that morning all across the northern world, in Orkney, in the Faroes, in Iceland, as if the whole web of the sea peoples shivered at once when the far western strand of it was cut. It is only a poem, of course, stitched into a saga by a Christian Icelander 2 centuries after the tide went out at Clontarf. But lie still with it a moment, because there is no better place than that loom to feel what stories are for, and why this night of ours has been full of them. The men at the fishing weir felt an ending, on both sides, and the poets, having no other instrument big enough, reached for the oldest loom in the northern imagination, fate itself, weaving, and cut the thread on camera, so to speak, so that no listener at any fireside from Dublin to Reykjavik could miss it. An age of the world was being finished off, and everyone had felt the shuttle stop. The chroniclers give us tides and casualty lists, the weavers give us the shiver, and the truth of a great turning needs both, and now we truly have both in hand. The spades and the sagas, the records and the loom, and we can go on, with everything gathered, to the last endings that remain. There is one more ending to tell before we gather up the whole story, and it is the softest and saddest, and in some ways the most mysterious of them all. And it happened far out on the western rim, in Greenland, where we left a few thousand farmers on their fjords under the inland ice, paying their tithes in walrus ivory, and it deserves telling slowly, because unlike every other ending in the Viking world, this one has no battle in it at all, only weather, and distance, and a long fading, like a lamp running out of oil in a room no one visits. For 3 centuries the 2 Greenland settlements did well enough, better than well in the good years, hundreds of farms, a cathedral with imported bronze bells and stained glass at a place called Gardar, with, the inventories note, enough cattle to keep the bishop in some style, and the ivory trade humming, because for centuries walrus tusk was the finest carving material Europe could get. Elephant ivory being locked away behind distant wars, and some of the loveliest objects of the whole Middle Ages, the famous walrus ivory chessmen found on the Isle of Lewis, with their round-eyed kings and their shield-biting rooks, were very likely carved from tusks that Greenland hunters took in the far northern hunting grounds and shipped south through Norway. The rim of the world supplying the parlours of its centre, but every strand of that lifeline ran through conditions that were changing. The climate itself turned, the centuries historians call the medieval warm period, which had made the whole Western adventure possible, giving way from the 1300s onward to the long chill of the Little Ice Age, and in Greenland that meant shorter hay summers, longer winters for the cattle in the byres, and, worst of all, more and more sea ice choking the sailing routes, so the ships from Norway, which had never been many, came fewer, and then rarely, and then hardly at all, and Norway herself, after the Great Plague gutted her ports, had less to send. Elephant ivory came back on the European market, and the price of walrus tusk sagged, taking the colony's one export with it, fashion, that most frivolous of forces, quietly helping to close a world. And meanwhile a new people were moving down the coast from the true north, the Tuli Innu, ancestors of modern Greenlanders, masters of the ice as the Norse never were. Hunters of seal from kayaks and whales from skin boats, expanding southward past the settlements, and the two peoples met, traded a little, the archaeology says, skirmished a little, the late annals hint, but mostly simply lived differently, and the difference is the story. Because as the cold came down, the Inuit way fit the land ever better, and the Norse way. Cattle and hay and imported iron and a bishop's stone cathedral fit it ever worse, and the Norse so endlessly adaptable everywhere else. In this one place, adapted too little, too slowly, clinging to the cow buyers and the European wardrobe, the graves yield fashionable Burgundian hoods, to the very end. The end itself is silence. The smaller western settlement went first. A visitor in the 1340s found the farms empty, cattle wandering loose, and not a soul, no bodies, no signs of battle, an abandonment, orderly or otherwise, into the fog of no records. The eastern settlement held on longer, and the very last documentary light we have from Norse Greenland is, of all the things it could have been, a wedding. In September of the year 1408, at the church of Fulsi, whose roofless stone shell still stands handsome by its fjord today, a visiting Icelandic couple married before witnesses, the paperwork in proper order, copied into Icelandic records when the ship got home. An utterly ordinary, hopeful, human event, and then nothing ever again. No final letter, no cry for help, just no more ships and no more news. And when Europeans next stood in those fjords, generations later, they found turf houses sinking back into the grass and Inuit families who had old stories about the farmers who used to live there. What exactly happened to the last of them, whether they starved slowly, sailed away piecemeal to Iceland and blended in, or dwindled by ones and twos past the point where a community can go on, the scholars still argue and the evidence still refuses to say, and perhaps at this hour of the night we can let the mystery be what it is, and note only the shape of it, that the same people whose age began with the most sudden, loudest arrival in European memory out of a clear morning at Lindisfarne, ended their furthest reach with the quietest departure imaginable, a lamp going out on the rim of the world with no one left to watch it, and the tide coming in over their landing places just the same. And the rest of the Viking world through those same centuries was simply, contentedly, becoming ordinary, which is its own kind of ending, and much happier. Denmark and Norway and Sweden settling into the medieval family of nations, building cathedrals, joining leagues, marrying their princesses to everyone, Iceland writing, always writing, even as she lost her independence to the Norwegian crown in the 1260s, the Orkneys and the Western Isles drifting from Norse earls to Scottish kings, the Isle of Man keeping to this very day. Its Norse-founded parliament, the Tynwald, which has met on its hill more or less continuously for over 1,000 years, and thereby politely contests Iceland's claim to the oldest assembly on earth. An argument between two Viking parliaments about which of them has been talking longest, which the old law speakers would have found entirely proper. And then, centuries after the last sail, came the strangest chapter of all, the return of the Vikings as an idea. Because Europe largely forgot them for 500 years, and when the Romantic Age rediscovered the sagas in the 17 and 1800s, it fell head over heels, poets and painters and composers seizing on the North as everything the polite classical world was not, wild, misty, doomed and free, and it was exactly then in the costume workshops of 19th century grand opera that some designer, wanting his stage Northman to read as pagan and primal from the cheap seats, reached for an old druidical prop and bolted horns onto their helmets, and the image escaped the opera house like a cat out a window and has been at large ever since, on football helmets and cereal boxes and the covers of 1,000 children's books, and not one excavated Viking helmet, and we have real ones, the sober-faced Gemunbu helmet in Oslo among them, has ever carried so much as a bump for a horn. So if you carry one single hard fact out of this whole night, let it be that, and let it make you smile as you drift. The most famous thing everyone knows about the Vikings is a theatre costume, The berserkers, the fur-shirted men who fought in a trance of fury, the sagas do vouch for, though what mixture of ritual, rage and reputation made them work no one can now say. And the gruesome Blood Eagle execution beloved of television may well be a misread poetic kenning that scholars have argued over for a century. And so it goes, all down the popular image, the truth being always both less lurid and more interesting, less horn and more keel, less skull cup and more set of folding bronze scales. And the real people, the farmer at his rake, the wife with the keys, the boy at the fish lines, the grandmother with the stories, standing patiently behind the costume all along, waiting, as they have waited all through this night to be seen plain, and now that we have seen them, the fire is truly low, and it is time to walk the whole road home in one last slow look. Consider then with your eyes closed what the people of the ships actually left behind them, because it turns out to be woven so deeply into the ordinary world that most of it no longer looks like a legacy at all. It just looks like things. Start with the map of Europe with their fingerprints and national borders. Russia, hugest of countries, carries in its very name the memory of the rowing crews of the River Road. Its first ruling house was theirs, its first cities theirs to fortify, and its choice of faith, made in the great city their convoys traded with, set the civilizational course of half a continent. Normandy is their bargain with a Frankish king grown into a French province, and through Normandy their line runs to the English crown, to the Norman kingdoms of the Mediterranean, and through the Norman descended aristocracies into the political history of most of the Western world. Ireland's chief cities are their trading posts grown up, Dublin above all, a Viking slave market become a European capital, which is as strange and as hopeful a transformation as history offers. England is, in a real sense, their accidental creation twice over, hammered into unity by resisting them, then refounded by their Norman descendants, and the Danelaw sleeps inside it still. Visible from any train window in the place names of the East and North, audible in every English sentence, because the language you are being lulled by tonight is itself the deepest legacy of all. English being at bottom a hybrid, its Anglo-Saxon frame packed with the plain Norse words two mingled peoples, all smoothed together. And when you say that, the sky looks like rain, or ask for a knife and an egg, or call someone your husband or your fellow, or complain that the whole thing seems wrong and makes you angry, or simply say they are here, their words, them, theirs. You are speaking, without knowing it, the peace treaty of the Danelaw, ratified afresh in every conversation in the English-speaking world, every hour, forever. The word law itself is theirs, which is its own quiet sermon. The people who arrived as the great breakers of other nations' laws, bequeathing the very word for it, and something of the practice too, the northern habits of the open-air assembly, the sworn body of neighbours declaring the facts, the law recited in public so that everyone owned it, flowing into the institutions of the Danelaw shires and onward, by channels historians trace with care and argument, into the deep foundations of English, and thence very much of the world's common law, while the two little Viking parliaments, on their Icelandic plain and their Manx hill, go on meeting, the longest-running conversations in political history. Their ships changed what human beings believed water was for, opening the Northern Ocean as a highway and stitching 4 continents worth of coastline, Newfoundland to the Caspian, into a single web of exchange centuries before anyone else could. And the towns they planted or supercharged at the web's knots, Dublin and York, Kiev and Novgorod, still stand at their rivers. Their explorations pushed the known world's edge west across the whole Atlantic in 4 generations, Faroes, Iceland, Greenland, Vinland, and if the American landing did not stick, the Icelandic one so profoundly did that the little republic of the settlers, population then and now roughly that of a mid-sized city, has given the world a medieval literature that stands with anything Greece or Rome. Produced and preserved besides the entire mythology of the pagan North, which in turn has soaked so thoroughly back into the modern imagination, through the romantics, through the fantasy shelf, through the cinema, that a child on any continent tonight can tell you about the one-eyed wanderer and the god of thunder, gods whose last official worshippers laid down the old ways 1,000 years ago. Even our own bodies keep the record, the geneticists reading in the blood of Iceland the Norse fathers and Celtic mothers of the settlement. In Orkney and Shetland, the deep Scandinavian layer. Along the Irish coasts and through the old Danelaw, the measurable northern thread. Millions of people carrying the age around in their cells, entirely unaware, and, one hopes, sleeping well on it. And the smallest legacies are somehow the best. The ones that fit in a pocket. The word window, which is Norse for wind-eye. The hole the breeze looks through. The word berserk. So that every time a toddler goes berserk in a supermarket the sagas are being cited, the initials of a 10th century Danish king glowing on the earbuds and speakers of the entire connected planet. An emblem. If you think about it, that would have pleased Harold Bluetooth enormously, king of joining things up. And the quiet fact that when the modern age wanted to name the sturdy little craft that carry people over dangerous water, lifeboats and landing craft and the rest, it reached again and again for their shapes and their words. Because in the end, the whole vast story keeps coming back to that one perfect object, the ship. And it is fitting that the most beautiful things the age left us, the carved prows rising in the museum halls of Oslo and Roskilde, under soft light, silent, wingless, at rest, are the very things that made all the rest of it happen, and that schoolchildren file past them every weekday morning. And that the ships which crossed oceans now hold still while the world comes to them, which seems, at the end of a long night, a fair retirement. So no, history does not disappear. It changes state, the way water does. The fury cools into farmsteads, the farmsteads into place names, the war fleets into words for ordinary things, the gods into stories for children, the terror of every coast in Europe into a museum ticket and a bedtime story, until the age is not behind us at all, but underneath us and inside us, in the sentence you think with, and the law you live under, and the map you were born onto. The ground, in every sense, beneath our feet, and the people of that age, who wanted one thing above all others, you remember, more than silver, more than land. They told us themselves, around the fires, in the poems, what they wanted. A good name after death, the one treasure time cannot touch. The words spoken of them when they are gone, and here we are. You and I, 11.5 centuries after a frightened boy watched 3 sails grow off the shining sands of Lindisfarne, lying comfortably in the warm dark on the far side of the world, speaking of them, still speaking of them, and so, by the only measure they truly cared about, of all the peoples who have ever lived, the Vikings may simply have won. Let us walk it back once, the whole road, slowly, the way you look back down a mountain path in the evening, not to climb it again, only to see the shape of where you have been. It began with ice, a mile of it, pressing the north down into silence, and the ice melted and left behind a drowned, beautiful country where the roads were water. And people followed the deer and the seals into it, and learned its one great lesson: boat before wagon, sea before land. They farmed the thin green edges, wove wool, burned driftwood, told stories down the long winters, met at the thing to speak law in the open air, and buried their great ones in ships. Because even eternity needed a keel. Their lords fed loyalty with silver rings, and the rings had to come from somewhere, and across the water the richest coasts in the world sat glittering and unwatched, and one summer morning in the year 793 the arithmetic sailed out of the north and fell on the holy island of Lindisfarne, and the world's map turned inside out, every river a road, every coast a door. The ships went everywhere then, west into Ireland where their raid camps grew into Dublin and her sister cities, south up the Seine and the Loire, sacking Paris on an Easter morning, taking the first great Danegeld from a Frankish king and learning the sweetest trick of the age, that fear collects taxes faster than kings do, and to England came not raiders, but the great heathen army. And the 4 English kingdoms fell one by one until only Wessex stood, held by a sick young bookworm named Alfred, who fled into the marshes in midwinter, burned some cakes, walked out in the spring, won at Eddington, and then did the unheard of thing. Made his enemy a godson and a neighbour instead of a corpse. Drew a line on the map of England and let Dane and Saxon farm their way toward being one people while he built the burghs and the ships and the schools that would let his grandchildren stitch the whole island into a single kingdom called England, a country the ships had, in effect, hammered into being. Meanwhile, the quiet ships, the ones the chronicles hardly noticed, were stepping west across the ocean, Faroes, then Iceland, where a whole free nation grew from an empty green page and crowned itself not with a king, but with an assembly on a lava plain. Then Greenland, sold to its settlers by the most optimistic estate agent in history. Then, for one bright, unsustainable moment, the coast of North America itself. Grapes and salmon, and a baby named Snorri, 5 centuries early, and eastward the same energy poured down the Russian rivers, portage by portage, the rowing men, the Rus, planting Novgorod and Kiev, hauling furs and, we did not look away, slaves to the silver markets, battering at Constantinople until the emperors sensibly put them on the payroll, the axemen of the Varangian guards scratching their names into the cathedral marble, their princes taking the faith of the Greeks and founding, without ever meaning to, Russia. And then, everywhere at once, the great settling, Rollo taking Normandy and his grandchildren becoming French-speaking knights with the old fire banked under new steel, Harold Bluetooth raising the stone at Jelling that baptized Denmark, the 2 Olafs dragging Norway to the font, the last of the old gods retiring into the poems, and England, rich and ill-led. Paying and paying under Aethelred the ill-advised until Svein Forkbeard simply took the whole kingdom, and his son Knut, the conqueror who chose to be a lawgiver, ruled England and Denmark and Norway as one sea empire, and taught his flatterers with wet shoes that no king commands the tide, and when his empire dissolved like the foam it was built on, the year 1066 gathered every thread for the finish, the last great sea king, Harald Hardrada, Varangian, millionaire, hero of 100 tall tales, coming down on Yorkshire with 300 ships to do the whole thing one final time, and receiving instead, at Stamford Bridge, his 7 feet of English ground, and 2 days later the winds turning fair for Normandy. So that the age ended twice in a single fortnight, the old Viking falling at the bridge, the new one, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, taking the kingdom at Hastings, the wheel closing on itself with a click that still echoes. After that, the long soft afterward, the kingdoms growing ordinary, Orkney's last expedition sailing off half pirate, half pilgrim, Greenland fading out in silence behind a wedding at Fulsi, and Iceland, dear Iceland, sitting down at last with calf skin and ink to write everything down, the gods, the kings, the farmers, the whole remembered age, so that 1,000 years later the Spades and the Sagas could check each other's work and find, at a bay in Newfoundland, that grandmother's fireside tales carry farther than anyone ever dares believe. Ice, then farms, then ships, then fury, then settlement, then faith, then law, then ink, then ground beneath our feet. That is the whole story, and you have walked every step of it tonight. And somewhere in the middle of it, I hope, you set down the day you were carrying. Because that is the other thing the long stories are for. They are heavy enough to take our small weights from us, the unanswered message, the unfinished list, the conversation that circled all evening, all of it borrowed for a few hours by monks and marshes and river roads, and by now, if the night has done its work, returned so much lighter that you can barely find it. The tide is in at Lindisfarne now, as it is every night, the causeway under quiet water, the island wrapped up in the sea, the ruins of the red sandstone priory standing open to the stars where the singing used to be, and pilgrims still walk out over those sands at low water, barefoot some of them, following the old posts, and seals still haul out on the rocks. And the North Sea still goes on to the horizon, grey and patient and entirely empty of dragon ships, and the same moon that lit the steersman home up his fjord is standing over your roof at this moment, and over Jelling and Kiev and Reykjavik and a bay in Newfoundland, keeping, as it has all along, the the whole story under one light. Everything settles, given time. Empires, feuds, languages, seas, days, whatever this day of yours held, it is joining the story now, one more small true thing that happened, and it will keep till morning, every bit of it, and morning is a long, safe way off. So let the fire fall to its last soft red now, and let the hall grow dark around the benches, the way it did on 10,000 northern winter nights, the household breathing slow under the wool, the cattle sighing at the far end, the wind walking on the roof turf, and finding everything fastened, everything held, everything safe. The ships are drawn up on the beach with their masts unstepped, and the sea has smoothed their wakes away as it smooths everything, and the watchman on the headland has seen nothing all night but stars, and has let his chin sink onto his knees, and is dreaming. Odin has his eye on other worlds tonight, and Thor's weather is far away beyond the mountains, a mutter too distant to count, and even fate, patient fate that waits for gods and kings alike, is content to wait one more night, for nothing is written that needs reading before morning. Breathe in slowly, and let it go, and feel how the breath leaves you the way the tide leaves the long sands, unhurried, certain, sure of coming back. There is nothing left to guard. The silver is buried, the lamps are out, the stories are all told, and the names, the good names, are safe, spoken and safe, which is all anyone ever wanted. Are you still awake? If you are, then somewhere behind your eyes the last longship is sliding out over dark glass water, oars shipped, sail furled, carried now only by the current, and you are welcome to drift along in her wake for as long as you like. And if sleep has not quite found you yet, there is another long story waiting for you on your screen. Another night road through another age, and you can let it begin and carry you the rest of the way down. And if these journeys bring you rest, you can press the like button and subscribe so that the next one knows where to find you. But gently, only if it is true. There is no hurry about anything now. Thank you for spending this night with me, out on the Whale Road among the farmers and the sea kings, and wherever you are lying in the wide dark world, in whatever city or valley or island at whatever hour the clock beside you claims it is. I hope the roof above you holds warm, and the walls hold quiet, and that your night runs before the wind, all the way to a kind morning. Close your eyes now. The tide is in, the causeway is under the silver water, and the island is keeping itself until the light comes back, and so can you. Good night and sweet dreams.